Forest mysteries.
The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Ezra knew only because the mail truck always groaned up the hill on Tuesdays, its engine catching and hiccuping on the last steep curve before the gravel flattened out near his gate. He heard it from inside, heard it the way he heard everything now, with his whole body leaning slightly toward the sound, the way a plant leans toward light it can no longer quite reach. The truck didn't stop. It slowed, and something soft landed in the metal box at the end of the drive, and then the engine faded back down the hill, and the woods swallowed the sound whole. Ezra sat at the kitchen table for a long time before he got up. The cabin had belonged to his father and his father's father before that, and it sat at the edge of the Appalachian woods in the kind of silence that most people found peaceful for about 20 minutes before it started pressing on them like a hand over the mouth. There was no electricity. There hadn't been since the line went down in the ice storm 3 winters ago, and Ezra had never called anyone to fix it. What would he have done with the light, anyway? He couldn't see. He moved to the door by memory, his right hand trailing the edge of the table, then the counter, then the wall where the coats hung his coat and Margaret's coat, still there, because taking it down had never seemed like the right thing to do, and now it had been so long that it simply existed as part of the wall, part of the cabin, part of him. His fingers brushed its sleeve as he passed, and he felt the old wool, rough and dry, and he didn't stop. Outside, the air hit him cleanly cold and sharp, carrying pine and something underneath the pine, something dark and wet, like turned earth, like the smell of a riverbank after rain. October in the mountains smelled like the world slowly shutting itself down. Ezra had always loved that smell, back when he could see the colors that went with it, the orange and deep red bleeding through the tree line, the low gray sky settling over the ridgeline like a lid. Now he only had the smell and the cold and the sound of his boots on the gravel path and the distant rhythmic drip of water from the gutter above the porch, where the metal had bent and never been straightened. The mailbox gave him the envelope without ceremony. He felt the shape of it standard, square, not thick, and ran his thumb over the front, where he knew there would be handwriting he couldn't read. He brought it inside and set it on the table and put his hands flat on either side of it, as if he could absorb what it said through the paper. He knew who it was from. There was only one person left in Cedar Falls who still wrote to him by hand, and that was Ruth Hadley, who had been Margaret's closest friend for 34 years, and who now wrote to Ezra on every birthday and every anniversary, with a kind of quiet, stubborn devotion that he had never asked for and had come over the years. To depend on in the same low, unspoken way that he depended on the creek running and the wind coming down from the ridge each evening. Tomorrow is Margaret's birthday. She would have been 68. Ezra sat with that fact the way he sat with most things now, without moving, without speaking, letting it settle through him like cold water, finding the shape of a stone. He had not visited or grave in 4 years. The cemetery was 7 miles down the mountain in Cedar Falls, and 7 miles might as well have been 700 when you were blind, and your truck had sat undriven in the yard since the spring of the year she died, its tires slowly flattening into the gravel, grass threading up through the wheel wells. He had meant to go. He had meant to go every year on this day, and every year October arrived, and the path down the mountain seemed to grow steeper, and the silence in the cabin seemed to grow heavier, and he stayed. It was his fault that she was gone. He knew that the way he knew the layout of the cabin without having to think about it, without being able to stop knowing it, every detail fixed and permanent in his. He made coffee by feel, filling the kettle from the pump, setting it on the gas burner, counting seconds the way Margaret had taught him in those first months after the diagnosis, when learning to live in the dark had felt like learning to live on the wrong planet. She had been patient. She had been more patient than he deserved, and he had repaid that patience with stubbornness and anger and one terrible decision that he had replayed every day for 4 years without arriving at a different ending. The coffee was too strong and too hot, and he drank it standing at the window, His face turned toward the glass, though the glass gave him nothing, no light, no shape, no movement in the trees, only the cold radiating off it against his cheek. By evening, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. He could feel it in the floor, rising through his socks, and in the way the walls seemed to tighten around him, the cabin contracting in the cold like something living. He ate crackers, canned soup heated on the burner, and washed the bowl and listened to the woods. The woods at night were not silent. That was something most people didn't understand. There was the wind, which moved differently through the bare trees than it had moved through the full-leaf summer ones, a thinner sound, more like breathing. There was the creek somewhere below the ridge, too far to hear clearly but present, a low vibration more felt than heard. There were the usual animals, the occasional snap of a branch, the short sharp cry of something small being caught by something larger, the intermittent dog barking from the Pattersons' farm half a mile east, carried on the wind in fragments. Ezra had learned all of it. He could read the woods the way he used to read a page, patiently, left to right, nothing skipped. Which was why, at some point past midnight, when he was lying on his back in the dark with his eyes open, an old habit, opening his eyes in the dark, as if one night they might actually find something, he heard the sound on the porch and knew immediately that it was wrong. Not the Pattersons' dog, not a raccoon, not a deer stepping too close. The weight of it was wrong, the rhythm of it was wrong, the deliberateness of it, each step placed carefully, without the nervous scatter of a small animal or the careless thud of a deer. Whatever was outside his door moved like something that knew exactly where it was going and had decided, for reasons of its own, to move slowly. Ezra lay still and did not breathe. The steps stopped directly outside the front door. He could feel the position through the walls the same way you feel a shadow fall across you before you see it, a change in the quality of the air, a shift in pressure, something aware on the other side of the wood, standing and waiting. Then it was gone, not retreating, gone between 1 second and the next, as if it had simply stopped existing. He lay in the dark for a long time afterward, his heart moving steadily in his chest, his hands flat on the blanket, and he thought about Margaret's birthday, and the unopened letter on the kitchen table, and the sound that had no name yet, and how the silence it left behind felt different from the silence that came before it. Fuller, somehow, like a room after someone has just left it. By the time the pale light of morning seeped through the clouds and pressed faintly against the cabin windows, Ezra had not truly slept, because every time his mind started to slide away into that gray place where dreams begin, he would hear again, not with his ears, but somewhere deeper, the memory of those measured footsteps crossing the porch. And he would feel the thin wooden boards of the floor under his back, as if the sound had sunk into them and stayed there. A faint echo he could not shake off, no matter how many times he turned his head on the flattened pillow or pulled the blanket higher over his shoulders in an attempt to block out a chill that came from inside, rather than from the October air. He rose later than usual, his body stubbornly heavy, and when he swung his feet to the floor, the cold crept up through the thin cotton of his socks and into his ankles, in a way that told him the temperature outside had dropped again during the night, maybe not to frost, but close enough that the breath of the woods would be white this morning, and the puddles in the ruts of the driveway would carry a skin of fragile glass that would crack if a boot stepped down wrong on it. And as he felt for his cane beside the bed, he thought, with a small impatient click of his tongue at himself, that an old man who lived alone at the end of a mountain road had no business staying in bed like a boy, just because of a sound he could not explain. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's coffee and the metallic tang of the cold stove, and as he moved toward the counter, he brushed the edge of the table with his thigh, and his hand fell, as if of its own accord, to the place where he had left the unopened envelope, his fingertips finding it exactly, his thumb resting on the fold of the sealed flap. And for a moment he stood there and let his fingers curl around the paper, feeling the tiny give of it, the slight thickness where Ruth's careful writing would sit in blue ink, and he told himself that he would open it after he checked outside, after he settled the uneasy feeling in his chest, that had nothing to do with letters, and everything to do with the sense that the cabin itself had changed shape overnight in some small way, as if the space between the front door and the woods had narrowed without his permission. He shrugged on his coat, the same heavy canvas one he had been wearing for 15 years, its lining thinned at the elbows and along the spine from 1,000 small frictions. And when he reached for the doorknob, he paused, his hand wrapped around the cold metal, because the memory of those steps stepped forward again in his mind, and for a beat his arm refused to move, as if his own body were warning him that whatever had stood outside last night might still be there, pressed against the other side of the wood, waiting in a stillness that had little to do with any animal he understood. He turned the knob anyway, because there was nothing else to be done, and when the door swung inward, the outside air came in all at once, cold and bright and smelling of whetstone and distant wood smoke, and that thin high scent that always rode on mountain mornings when the clouds sat low over the ridge and the mist had not yet lifted from the hollows. And he stepped out onto the porch boards that creaked softly under his weight, each familiar protest in the lumber, a reassurance that the cabin, at least, remained what it had always been. The sound of the world greeted him carefully, the faint clatter of a loose tin panel on the shed in the slight breeze, the far-off murmur of the creek swollen from last week's rain, the occasional soft tick of melting frost giving way on the railings, drops falling into old nail holes, and under all of it, the wide quiet of the woods. That particular Appalachian hush that was never complete silence, but a layered breathing of earth and leaf and distant feathered movement. And it was in that hush that he realized there was something else, something directly ahead of him in the yard that his ears could not quite make out, but that his skin registered as an interruption in the way sound bounced back from the open space. He stepped down from the porch, one hand lightly on the railing, and as his boots left the boards and met the ground, he felt it at once. The earth had a different give under his soles, softer and slightly uneven, and as he shifted his weight, the gravel that usually crunched dry and loose underfoot now yielded with a muted, damp sound. That told him a thin crust of old snow or frost had softened, and he frowned, because although cold had settled in, snow this early was unusual even up here. And he could not remember the feel of any falling in the night, no faint static on the roof, no gentle hiss against the windows, and yet the yard smelled like snow, like chilled minerals and distant ice. He took 2 careful steps forward, his cane tapping ahead of him until it met something that was not the packed path, a shallow depression that caught the tip of the stick and held it for a heartbeat before releasing it with a soft crumbling sound. And the hairs on his forearms rose under his coat because he knew that feel as well as he knew the layout of his own hands. He was standing in the track of something large that had passed close to his front steps, close enough that if he had opened the door in the small hours, it would have been no more than an arm's length away. Slowly, so slowly that his knees complained and his lower back sent out a thin line of pain, he bent down and set his free hand flat on the stiff cold surface of the yard, the chill biting through the skin of his palm as his fingers groped forward, spreading like the legs of a pale blind spider, feeling its way along an unfamiliar wall, until finally his fingertips slipped into the hollow of the first print, and he inhaled sharply through his nose, because the shape of it told him at once that this was no dog, no deer, no fox whose screams sometimes tore through winter nights, and made newcomers lock their doors tight, even though the animal itself posed little danger. This was larger, heavier. The pads broad and deep with a clear impression of claws at the tips. The span between prints long enough that he had to stretch his arm to find the next one. He traced the outline, slow and methodical, his rough fingertips moving from one toe pad to the next, feeling the width of them, the depth, the way the edges of the print had crumbled slightly, as if the animal had paused there, shifting its weight instead of moving in a straightforward, uninterested stride, and as he knelt in the cold mud, breath clouding faintly in front of his face, where he could not see it, he thought, with a clarity that pushed away for a moment the dull fog that usually lay across his thoughts, that a wolf had stood in his yard while he lay in bed counting the beats of his own heart, and that it had been close enough to touch. Wolves did not come this close to people, not ordinarily, not in a place where there were still men with rifles and traps, and the long memories carried down from older generations, who never forgot what a hungry pack could do to a winter's stores. And even though the government and the conservation folks on the radio spoke now in measured, cautious tones about balance and ecosystem and protected numbers, people here still told children not to wander too far at dusk and still left their porch lights on just in case a pair of yellow eyes watched from the tree line. Yet the prints under Ezra's hand were fresh and unhurried, the edges only just starting to soften in the weak morning warmth, as if whatever had passed through here had not been afraid at all. The external fact of the danger was simple and immediate and sat heavy on his shoulders. A wolf, large enough to leave such tracks and bold enough to come to his door could, if it chose, be on him before he even found the knob or lifted his cane, could knock him off his feet with the force of its body and be at his throat while he lay helpless, sightless, scrambling in the cold for a weapon that was not there, because the shotgun above the mantel had not been loaded in years, and even if it had been, he doubted, could find the shells in time or aim it at anything other than the wall. Alongside that picture, however, running so close to it that the two nearly tangled, was a different sensation entirely, one that made him curl his fingers more tightly into the snow-slick edge of the print instead of recoiling from it. A bright, unwelcome thread of curiosity wound through the gray tangle of his usual thoughts, tugging at him with almost physical force, because the fact that the animal had come so close and yet not broken the door or scratched at the wood, had not circled the cabin in agitation, had not given voice to any drawn-out hungry howl, suggested an intention he could not easily frame, and in the absence of a clear rational explanation, his mind began to reach for other possibilities, ones he did not want to name. He did not want to be at the mercy of any creature, whether it walked on 4 legs or 2, and the idea of needing help, of calling out into the dark for another living thing to come and guide him, scraped at his pride the way a bramble scraped at bare skin when you push too deep into the undergrowth. Yet as he knelt there with his knees slowly numbing against the cold ground, he realized that what scared him most was not the thought of sharp teeth and the sudden weight of a body slamming into him, but the thought of being left alone again after having proof, stamped into the thin layer of snow and mud, that something out there had chosen his small decaying corner of the world, and stood a moment at his door. He straightened with effort, his joints protesting, and followed the line of the prints by touch, and by the faint changes in the earth under his boots, his cane tapping each depression ahead of him, like the punctuation marks in a sentence written in a language he did not quite speak, but could almost feel himself beginning to understand, and as he moved slowly out into the yard, away from the safety of the porch and the known boundaries of the packed path to the shed. The air seemed to grow thinner, the sounds of the woods holding their breath around him, because out here any misstep could mean a twisted ankle, a fall, a long humiliating crawl back to the cabin. When he reached the place where the tracks finally turned toward the tree line and disappeared into the thicker layer of old leaf and new frost beneath the first rank of pines, he stopped, the toes of his boots on the very edge of where he could feel the change between open yard and rougher forest floor, and stood with his face lifted slightly, his nostrils flaring as he tried to draw in any lingering trace of the animal on the air, some warm, musky note beneath the cold and the resin and the faint smoke. But if the wolf had carried any particular scent, it had already thinned and scattered, leaving him with nothing but the ghost of its passage, and the deepening sense that the world had tilted by a fraction of a degree without his consent. The first dog bark of the morning floated up from the Pattersons' place, a sharp yelping series that broke off quickly, as if whatever had set the animal off had already moved on, and somewhere further off a crow called once, a harsh caw that cut through the softer sounds like a nail dragged down old slate, then fell silent again, and Ezra, feeling the chill finally bite in earnest into his hands and cheeks, turned back toward the cabin, each step measured and careful, the knowledge of those tracks walking alongside him like a second presence. Inside, the cabin felt smaller, the ceiling lower, as if the walls had inched closer together while he stood in the yard, and when he closed the door and slid the deadbolt by habit, the click of metal on metal sounded thin to his ears, an old ritual against a new kind of intrusion, and he stood for a long breath with his back against the wood, his palms flat against it, tracing unconsciously the faint vibrations from the outside world that still shivered through the frame, wondering whether the wolf would come back that night and, if it did, whether he would be any more prepared to face it than he had been the night before, or whether he would once again lie in the dark listening to the deliberate pace of its steps on the porch and feel, mingled with the fear that pinned him to the mattress, a dangerous, inexplicable pull toward the door. The second night came down thicker than the first, the clouds hanging low enough over the ridge that Ezra could feel their weight in the air, pressing against the top of his skull, and as afternoon drained itself away into that long gray hour, when the woods grew quiet in anticipation of dark, he moved through the cabin with a restlessness that did not suit a man his age. His fingers touching old objects as if they were new, the back of a chair, the corner of the stove, the chipped rim of the sink, tracing each familiar edge without really feeling it, because his mind was turned always toward the front door and the yard beyond it, where the memory of those deep measured tracks lay like a fresh bruise beneath a shirt. He told himself he was being foolish, that a wolf would have no reason to come back to a blind man's porch once it had satisfied its curiosity, that its world was a far larger and more urgent one of deer trails and rabbit runs, and the scent of blood in the snow, yet when darkness finally gathered itself properly outside, and began to press its face against the windows, the silence between the usual night sounds became so loud that it seemed to buzz against his eardrums, and he found himself sitting on the edge of his bed fully dressed, boots laced, coat already on, his cane leaning against his thigh as if at any moment someone might knock and call his name. No one knocked. Instead, somewhere between one breath and the next, a single clear sound rose out of the woods and poured across the yard and through the walls as easily as water. A long, low note that began deep in the chest and climbed in a slow, unbroken line until it thinned at the top into something sharp enough to mark the air. And although Ezra had heard coyotes yipping and foxes screaming and dogs baying in the years he had lived on this ridge, he had never heard anything quite like this, because there was no chatter in it, no stutter or break or answering chorus, only one sustained howl that seemed less a call to others than a statement of presence, directed not at the wide forest, but at a single point upon it. He knew that point was his cabin. The sound went on longer than he thought possible, and when it finally faded, the silence that followed had a different shape than before, filled with a kind of waiting that made the small hairs along his forearms lift beneath the sleeves of his shirt, and without letting himself think too much about what he was doing, he stood, his knees crackling, and reached for his cane, and made his slow way toward the front door, the wooden boards under his soles creaking in their familiar pattern. Each groan of the floor another beat of his heart. His hand found the knob by habit, cold metal beneath the worn pads of his fingertips, and there on the threshold of warm, stale cabin air and cold, clean outside air he hesitated. Because once he opened the door, there would be no taking the moment back, no returning to the safe small lie that whatever had happened in his yard, the last 24 hours existed only as a set of impressions in his palms and ears. If he stepped beyond the frame now and the animal was there, close enough to touch, then his world would crack along new lines, and if it was not there, if there was nothing, then perhaps he would have to admit that his mind, left too long alone in the dark, had begun to shape ghosts out of ordinary night sounds. He opened the door anyway, and the cold came in sharp and immediate, slipping under his coat and up the back of his neck like a wet finger, carrying with it the damp smell of leaf mold, and the faint sweetness of decaying pine needles, and the distant trace of smoke from some unseen neighbor's chimney lower down the mountain, and under all of that, so faint that he might have missed it, if he had not been stretching his senses forward like someone leaning out over a balcony. There was another scent, warm and musky and edged with wildness, something that did not belong to wood or stone or human sweat. He stepped out onto the porch with his left hand on the railing and his right hand holding the cane, And even before his boots touched the boards, he knew he was not alone, because the air ahead of him felt full, the way a room feels when another body shares it, a subtle difference in the way sound moves and returns, and as he took one cautious step forward. His cane brushed against something that was not railing or post or wall, something that yielded like muscle under thick fur and then tensed, and his breath stopped in his throat. For a moment that stretched so thin it might have broken, neither of them moved. Ezra's hand, acting without permission from any sensible part of his mind, left the safety of the railing and reached out into the cold space ahead of him until it met that same yielding resistance his cane had found, and his fingers sank into fur that was dense and warm and slightly damp near the surface from the evening mist. The texture of it unlike any dog he had ever owned, thicker and more layered, as if it had been grown for a different kind of winter. And beneath that fur he felt a solid roll of muscle, as the animal shifted just enough to balance its weight under his touch. His heart went hard and fast against his ribs, hammering in a way he had not felt since the day the doctor said the word blind out loud in his office and the floor had seemed to tilt. Yet his hand did not jerk back, because in the instant of first contact, beneath the knife-sharp edge of terror that whispered of teeth and sudden violent movement, there was also a deep, unexpected pulse of recognition, as if some part of him had been waiting for this exact sensation, this exact warmth, for longer than he had known. The wolf did not growl, did not bare its teeth or pull away. It stood there on the porch, its breathing slow and heavy, each exhale a small cloud in the cold that Ezra could not see, but could feel as a faint warmth on the back of his hand, and as his fingers spread slightly and pressed more firmly into the thick ruff of its neck. He realized that the animal had positioned itself not facing him, but turned outward, its body angled, so that his hand rested on its shoulder rather than on its throat, as if it had come not to challenge but to offer something. A thought rose in him then, unbidden and irrational and yet so bright, could not push it down, that the wolf wanted him to come with it, that the single long howl had been less a warning than a call, not to others of its kind, but to the blind man alone in the cabin who had not left his mountain in years, and who had allowed guilt and fear to narrow his world to 4 wooden walls and a worn path to the shed. And along with that thought came another, equally wild and yet rooted in simple, stubborn human need, that somewhere out there in the fog-soaked woods lay the old spring he had not visited since Margaret died, the place where they used to go on warm evenings to sit on the rocks and let the cold water run over their bare feet, and that if he did not find his way back to it soon, the last living thread between him and her would rot away completely. His grip on the wolf's fur tightened slightly, and he felt the animal shift again, stepping forward with deliberate slowness, its shoulder nudging his thigh in a way that toppled his balance, just enough that he had to move with it or fall. And once they had taken that first step together, the rest came almost as naturally as breathing, one foot in front of the other, his cane tapping uselessly at his side while his left hand remained buried in that thick coat, each stride guided by the steady, patient pull of the body beside him. The yard passed beneath his boots without his really noticing, the familiar landmarks of the porch and mailbox and packed path slipping away behind him, as they crossed the boundary where the gravel ended, and the softer, uneven give of the forest floor began, and immediately the air changed again, growing damper and cooler, the smells intensifying into a mix of wet soil and rotting leaves, and the sharp, slightly citrus scent of broken pine needles underfoot. And as branches brushed the shoulders of his coat and sometimes his cheek, leaving behind thin streaks of cold, he realized with a start that they were moving along no path he remembered. Once, years ago, he had known every trail that spiderwebbed off this ridge, had walked them in every season with Margaret at his side, counting steps and turns, marking landmarks, a split rock here, a fallen birch there, so that if he ever had to navigate them without sight, he would have mental hooks to catch on to. Yet now, as he let the wolf lead him deeper into the thickening fog, he could not match what he felt underfoot with any of those stored patterns. The ground dipped when he expected it to rise, trees stood where none had stood before in his memory, the distant murmur of the creek came from the wrong direction, and a thin scared voice in his mind, hissed that this was madness, that it was placing his life in the jaws of an animal whose motives he could not fathom. Another voice, quieter but steadier, asked what life he thought was preserving in that crooked little cabin, counting out the days by the mail truck's appearances and the angle of the cold through the floorboards, and whether dying alone in the bed where Margaret had once lain beside him was truly a better end than following a strange guide into the fog toward a place that had mattered to them both. The forest around them was almost entirely sound now, shapes stripped away from Ezra's world years ago, so that only noise and touch remained, and tonight the noise wrapped close around him, the soft shush of mist sliding between bare branches, the occasional drip as moisture gathered on a leaf and then fell to the ground, the small sharp report of twigs snapping under the wolf's careful paws, which always seemed to find a safe place for his boots next and somewhere ahead. Faint but growing slowly stronger, the continuous low rush of moving water, not the wide sprawling sound of the creek, but something more concentrated, like breath pushed through narrowed lips. With every step, the air grew colder and damper until tiny droplets collected on the exposed skin of his face, running down from his forehead along the hollow, by his temples into the corners of his jaw and his fingers, stiff from clenching the wolf's fur, began to sting as the chill worked its way past the animal's warmth into his knuckles. Yet he did not loosen his hold, because he knew that if he let go now, he would be alone in a patch of woods he no longer recognized, with no sure sense of which way his cabin lay. There was a point it might have been 10 minutes into the walk, or 30. Time had stretched too thin for him to trust it when the ground dropped under his right foot more sharply than it had before, and his leg wobbled, his heels skidding slightly on damp rock, and for a brief 6 seconds he felt the pull of gravity toward emptiness, the weight of his own body, starting to tilt beyond his control, and in that same instant the wolf's muscles bunched under his hand, its whole frame bracing. Leaning against his hip in a firm, countering pressure that pulled him back from the fall, its paws adjusting on the slope with perfect balance, so that he had something solid to brace against, until he found his footing again. He stood there panting, not from exertion, but from the sudden flash of fear, his breath clouding the air in front of his face, his free hand flung out blindly toward the void he had nearly stepped into, and finding instead the rough wet surface of a boulder, slick with moss and condensation, and the realization that the animal had anticipated his misstep, had compensated for it, settled in his chest like a new weight, heavy but not entirely unwelcome, because it suggested intention rather than accident in every choice it had made since leaving the porch. The sound of water grew louder, filling more of the spaces between their footfalls, and as they moved forward again, the ground leveled out into a small flat clearing where the air shifted once more, taking on a sharper, cleaner edge that cut through the layered smells of earth and decay. And when the wolf finally stopped, the sudden absence of forward motion made Ezra sway slightly. His hands still tangled in the thick fur, his boots planted on damp stone that vibrated faintly with the nearby flow. He let go then, because something in the quiet posture of the animal beside him said that this was as far as it would lead, and as his fingers slipped free, the wolf stepped away, the warmth of its body leaving his side so quickly that the cold rushed into the gap like water filling a mold, and he heard the soft pat of its paws as it circled once, twice, and then settled somewhere just beyond the edge of his reach, its presence now a sound and a scent rather than a physical support. The rush of the spring was directly ahead of him, close enough that tiny droplets of its spray touched the backs of his hands when he lifted them tentatively, and as he took a careful step forward, feeling for the edge with the toe of his boot, he found the smooth, familiar curve of rock that had framed this water for longer than he had been alive, its surface worn by countless seasons, and the weight of two younger bodies that had once sat here shoulder to shoulder, talking about nothing and everything as the sun went down. He lowered himself slowly, knees protesting and spine complaining, until he was seated on the cold stone with his boots braced against a lower ledge, and then he leaned forward and reached down, his fingers searching, until they broke the surface of the spring, and the water closed around them like the grip of a hand that knew him, so cold it burned. So clear he could almost feel its transparency, an honesty that brought an ache to his throat he had not expected. Memories rose with the chill, unspooling in the dark behind his useless eyes, Margaret's laugh as she flicked water at him, the way the light had caught in the strands of her hair and turned them into thin lines of copper, the sound of her voice when she teased him about the stubborn streak that would one day be the death of him, the last argument they had had about coming down here alone, after his vision had already begun to fail, and how he had brushed off her concern with a bitterness that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with his pride. He sat there in the damp, echoing hollow of the spring's clearing, his hands numb in the streaming water, and for the first time in 4 years he allowed himself to believe fully that he had found his way back to the place where so much had been good before it went bad, and that he had done so not by his own strength or cleverness, but because something wild and untamed had offered him its back in the darkness, and he had been just desperate or just brave enough to accept. He turned his head slightly toward where he could hear the soft, steady breathing of the wolf, only a few feet away, and opened his mouth, not entirely sure which name he meant to speak first the animal's, which he did not know, or Margaret's, which he had not said out loud in weeks, and in that suspended moment, with the cold water tightening the skin around his bones, and the fog pressing in from the trees, and the unseen eyes of his guide fixed on him, the line between the living and the dead, between what was real and what might only be the invention of a man left too long alone, felt thinner than the edge of the rock beneath his palms. By the time another October dragged itself up the mountain and settled into the hollows like a tired animal, Ezra's world had shrunk even further than he would have thought possible, because where once the boundary had been the tree line and the faint curve of the ridge against the sky, and later the packed path to the shed and the length of the porch, now there were days when the edges of his existence seemed to be no wider than the space between his bed and the kitchen table, and even that small distance sometimes felt like a journey requiring more will than his body wished to provide. The seasons had done their work on the cabin and on the man inside it. The roof complained louder in the wind, the boards shifted more under the weight of weather and time, and his joints mirrored the building's protests, stiffening in the cold, aching in the damp, telling him with every slow, careful step that another year had passed whether he had wanted it or not, and that he had used that year mostly to listen to his own breathing and the long, indifferent breaths of the woods outside. He kept the days in order by small, stubborn acts, because if he let go of those thin threads of routine, he feared time would dissolve entirely, leaving him floating in a featureless gray where morning and night and weekday and Sunday were all the same. So he counted the clanks of the mail truck on the ruts of the road on Tuesdays and Fridays, and the distant church bell from Cedar Falls on Sunday afternoons when the air was clear enough for sound to climb the hill. And he ran his fingers over the notches he had cut into the rough beam by the stove, one for each month, and though the marks were not evenly spaced, and sometimes his knife had slipped, the rough sequence at least told him that autumn had come round again, and with it the date he had not been able to forget, even in the worst fogs of his memory. He had not seen the wolf since the night at the spring, although seen was hardly the right word for a man whose eyes had long ago ceased to be anything more than pale ornaments in a wrinkled face. And perhaps it would have been more accurate to say that he had not felt the wolf, had not heard its paws on the porch, or its single unanswerable howl in the dark, had not sensed the warm solidity of its body beside his own, as it guided his clumsy, failing steps down a path he no longer remembered. Yet the absence of that presence weighed just as heavily as its arrival once had, because there were nights when he woke with his hand curled as if in thick fur, his fingers closing on nothing, the phantom sensation so strong that he had to sit up and lace them together tightly to assure himself that he had not somehow lost the animal in the bedclothes like a misplaced tool. His sight had not returned. He had never truly expected it to, despite the early hopeful talk from doctors who had murmured about advances in trials and the possibility of partial restoration, and if anything, the darkness seemed deeper now, as if whatever faint impression of light and shadow he had once been able to detect had been rubbed away by time, leaving behind a blackness so complete that occasionally, when he sat too long without moving, he felt as if he were falling inward through it, away from the cabin, away from the mountain, away from the particular web of sounds and smells that anchored him to this patch of earth. Names slipped more readily out of his grasp as well. Sometimes he would reach for the memory of a man he had worked with at the mill, and come up with only the smell of sawdust and the clang of metal on metal. Or he would think of his mother, and be unable to recall the line of her jaw, only the feel of her hand on the back of his neck when he was a boy, steering him away from trouble. And although he could still recite the Lord's Prayer without stumbling, he had to pause longer now before saying Margaret's name out loud, not because he had forgotten it, but because there was a fleeting terrifying instant when it hovered just beyond his tongue, as if it might, with enough neglect, dissolve. The outside world, which had always been a little distant from a man who preferred his own company, and who had spent most of his adult life either at the mill or in these woods, receded further with each passing month. He missed the funeral of a neighbor because no one thought to come up the hill and tell him in time, and when Ruth Hadley visited twice over the summer, the second time bringing a nephew to check the roof, he found himself groping for topics of conversation that did not involve the slow movements of his own declining body, because he had so little new to offer that was not some minor variation of the same small discomforts and small satisfactions that filled his days. The radio had broken in March, and he had never asked anyone to fix it, partly out of pride, and partly because the silence that followed its last wheezing weather report had settled over the cabin like a blanket. He found himself both smothered by and reluctant to throw off. The autumn that followed came in wet and heavy, the kind of season where rain did not arrive in thunderous storms, but in long patient drizzles that seemed to seep straight out of the air itself, turning the world into a saturated sponge that never quite dried. The leaves, when they finally let go of the branches, did not fall in crisp, swirling flurries as they had some other years, but dropped sodden and dark, slapping softly against the ground, piling into mats that smelled of sour earth and faint rot, and that smell crept into the cabin through the cracks around the windows and under the door, mingling with the persistent sense of old wood and cooled ash and the iron tang of the pump water, so that when Ezra lay awake at night, he sometimes felt as if he were already half buried in a shallow grave of wet leaves, the weight of them pressing down on his chest with each damp breath. His body did not like the wet, his knees swelled, his fingers ached, and a deep, dull pain settled low in his back and refused to leave, making every movement a negotiation between what needed to be done and what he could bear to do. Some mornings he stared into the dark behind his eyes and counted out each necessary task in his head: pump water, light stove, make coffee, swallow pills, check door, and each one felt like a stone he had to lift and carry across a field. Yet he did them because the alternative was to lie in bed and let his muscles atrophy, and his mind wander unmoored through the thinning memories, and while he had no great love for the way his days were arranged, he feared the loss of even that meager structure more than he feared death. Beneath the familiar complaints of his bones and the increasing unreliability of his memory, there thrummed a quieter, more insistent unease that he rarely allowed himself to look it straight on, because when he did, when he followed it to its source, he found there not the fear of wolves or falls or illness, but the fear that the one strange inexplicable mercy that had entered his life that autumn night a year ago would not repeat itself, that the wolf, if it had ever been a wolf in the ordinary sense, had done what it came to do and had no further use for an old man clinging to a crooked cabin on a dying ridge, and that he, Ezra, had been given a single undeserved chance to return to the spring and to the memory of his wife, and had spent the rest of the year afterward exactly as he had spent the years before, pacing the same narrow paths of sorrow and regret without ever stepping beyond them. He tried on some days to convince himself that, had imagined the entire encounter, that there had been no warm fur under his fingers, No steady pressure of a heavy body at his hip, no careful steering away from a sudden drop on the trail, only the mind of an isolated man making patterns in the dark where none existed, filling the blankness with whatever shapes would keep him company, and the more he read, with his fingers and his ears, about the ways in which age could twist memory and perception and turn shadows into figures, the easier it became to accept that explanation in the bright hours, yet at night, when the damp pressed against the cabin like a living thing, and the wind pushed thin fingers through the cracks and stroked the back of his neck, the thought that the wolf might return wrapped itself around his chest with a grip that felt too real to be dismissed as mere fancy. On the day before Margaret's birthday, the rain eased for the first time in a week, thinning from a steady curtain to a fine mist that hung in the air, and turned the light, what little of it managed to filter through the clouds, a flat colorless gray that made even the trees seem reluctant to move, their branches heavy and still. Ezra felt the change as soon as he swung his legs out from under the blankets. The floor was cold in a different way, the air in the cabin thicker, the smell of wet leaves sharper, and as he dressed with his usual slow care, pulling on socks that took longer to navigate over stiff toes than they once had, he had the irrational sense that the world outside was holding its breath in anticipation of something that had nothing to do with human calendars or remembered dates, and everything to do with cycles older than his family's claim on this ridge. By late afternoon, the damp had settled into his bones so thoroughly that he moved as if through water, his limbs heavy and his thoughts slower, dragging, so he made himself a second cup of coffee, the cheap bitter kind that tasted more of metal and heat than of any particular bean, and sat at the table, his hands wrapped around the warm mug, listening to the way the droplets still sliding from the eaves tapped against the steps in an irregular pattern, like someone drumming careless fingers on a countertop, and as he sat, something at the back of his mind tugged insistently at him, a small voice asking whether he had really believed that a year could pass without the balance that had been shifted that night, demanding some sort of reckoning. The daylight thinned and then was gone, and the cabin slowly filled with the soft, uncertain dark that came before he lit the lamps, a dark that did not so much obscure as smooth away edges, turning the familiar shapes of chairs and shelves into vague presences pressed up against the walls. When he finally stood and reached for the matches, his fingers found the box on the first try, but for a moment they lingered there on the rough cardboard, because he realized that if he struck a flame now and filled the cabin with that small human light, the night outside would be pushed a little farther away, while some part of him, some strange stubborn part, barely recognized as his own, wanted the night as close as it could possibly get, wanted nothing between him and the sounds that might rise out of the woods. He left the lamps unlit. Instead, he moved to the bed and sat on its edge, as he had done the previous year, boots already laced, cane leaning against the frame within easy reach, his ears straining against the thick hush that lay over the cabin, trying to separate the ordinary noises, the creak of the building as it settled in the cool, the faint skitter of a mouse in the wall, the occasional distant swish of a car far down the mountain from anything new, anything that did not belong to habit and routine. His pulse was too loud in his own ears, filling the spaces between notes, and more than once he caught himself holding his breath, listening for something he could not define, but would know the instant it arrived. When it did, it came not as an abrupt interruption, but as a slow swell, like fog thickening in a low place, the usual murmur of the woods falling away in layers, until what remained was a quiet so dense it seemed to press against the cabin walls, and then, floating within that quiet, a familiar sound rose, reshaped by time and distance yet unmistakable. A long, low howl that started somewhere deep in the bones of the earth and climbed into the wet, heavy air outside. Vibrating in the wood of the porch, in the glass of the windows, in the old man's ribs, a single sustained note that did not crack or waver despite the damp, that carried not hunger or anger but a kind of grave insistence, as if the sender knew exactly who would hear it, and exactly what old ache it would stir awake. The storm had been building all afternoon, not with the sudden theatrical crashes of a summer thunderhead, but with a slow grinding accumulation of weight in the clouds, the sky lowering hour by hour until it felt to Ezra as if the whole gray lid of it were resting on the ridge, pressing its damp palms down on the trees and the cabin and the old man inside. And by the time dusk began to bleed into the hollows, the air had thickened into something he could almost chew, each breath heavy with the smell of wet dirt and sap and the metallic tang that always came before hard rain. He sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a mug that had long since cooled, the ceramic now merely a shape between his fingers instead of a source of warmth, and listened to the first scattered drops strike the roof and the porch steps in hesitant patterns, like a drummer feeling for a rhythm, and he thought, with a weary reluctant clarity, that if the wolf were going to come this year, it would come on a night like this, when the way down the mountain would be at its worst, and a man with good eyes and strong legs might think twice about leaving shelter, let alone one who moved by touch through a world that only revealed itself 1 inch of floorboard at a time. His mind had been nipping at the same set of questions all week, circling them the way a hungry dog circles a bone it is not entirely sure it has the right to take. Questions about whether he had merely dreamed that strange journey a year before, whether an animal that belonged to the woods in its own obscure patterns would concern itself twice with an old human's path to a half-forgotten spring, whether it was pride or terror that made his chest tighten when he admitted, even silently, that he wanted the wolf to return, not only for the promise of guidance, but for the simple, selfish relief of having something else in the dark that was not his own echoing thoughts. Every time he pushed those thoughts aside and tried to occupy himself with small tasks, mending a tear in his sleeve by feel, sorting the dwindling pile of firewood by size, counting the jars on the pantry shelf, they would creep back around the edges of his awareness, and now, as the rain thickened into a steady drumming, and the wind began to worry at the corners of the roof, lifting and dropping a loose shingle in an irregular thud that set his teeth on edge, he knew that the time for circling was past, and that whatever answer the night held would not be kept at bay by distraction. When the howl came, it did not startle him the way it had the first time, because somewhere beneath his fears and doubts, he had been braced for it, waiting for that long single note to unfurl itself across the soaked woods. And when it rose, drawn out and unwavering despite the wind, it threaded itself through the slap of rain on the roof, and the rattle of branches against the siding, as if those noises were nothing more than an accompaniment to its own clear line. The sound vibrated in the boards under his feet and in the hollow of his chest, and for a moment he sat very still, his fingers locked around the mug, as if he were holding on to the last solid object in a world that had begun to slide. Then he set the cup down carefully, feeling for the edge of the table, and stood, his knees protesting the sudden demand, because he understood that if he ignored this call, if he stayed seated and let the howl ebb away unanswered into the rain, he would be choosing a smaller, meaner kind of life than even he deserved. He crossed the cabin in a series of slow, deliberate steps, his palm brushing Margaret's coat on its peg, the rough wool sending a small ache flaring through his ribs, and when he reached the door, he rested his forehead briefly against the cool wood, letting the thunder of the rain on the porch roof drum against his skull, a wild, chaotic beat that made the wolf's earlier note seem in comparison like a line of scripture carved cleanly into stone. His hand found the knob, slick with a faint sheen of condensation seeping through from outside, and as he turned it, he said her name under his breath for the first time that day, not as a plea exactly, and not quite as a curse, but as something in between, a rough half-formed sound that carried within it an apology he had still never spoken in full. The door opened onto a wall of water so thick that the air beyond it felt like a solid thing, and the cold leaped at him as if it had been straining against the wood for hours, pushing into the sleeves of his shirt and under the collar of his coat with tiny teeth of wind-driven droplets that stung his skin, carrying with them the heavy tidal smells of saturated earth and bruised leaves, and the sour tang of something small and dead somewhere under the porch. For an instant he almost stepped back, the old animal part of his brain recoiling from the prospect of leaving shelter to walk into a night where even shapes would have been smudged and uncertain for someone with full sight. But then he heard it, not another howl, not some grand heraldic sound, but the soft, unmistakable scuff of padded feet on the wet boards to his left, followed by the faint, steady rhythm of breath at hip height, warm and close. And the part of him that had been waiting all year loosened its grip on his fear enough that he could move. He reached out into the stormy dark, and his hand found fur again, slicker this time with moisture, the outer guard hairs beaded with rain, so that his fingers slid along them before sinking into the dense undercoat. And beneath the pelt's shifting slickness, he felt the same coiled strength as before, the same controlled readiness. The sense that every muscle in the animal's body was paying attention to both him and the world beyond him at once. He did not speak to it right away, not because he had nothing to say, but because words seemed too thin for the current that ran between his palm and that living warmth. Instead, tightened his grip slightly, feeling the skin bunch under his fingers in a small responsive ripple, and stepped forward, letting the wolf's movement set the pace. The yard had turned to mud in the hours since the storm began in earnest. The packed gravel path dissolved into a slick, treacherous smear that sucked at his boots with each step, so that he had to lift his feet higher than usual to keep from being held in place, and more than once his heel slid sideways on some unseen film of wet leaves, and he lurched, his free arm flinging out to catch balance on a world he could not see. Each time the wolf's body shifted under his guiding hand with uncanny precision, leaning into him at exactly the angle needed to keep him upright, bracing without jolting, its claws digging into the softened ground with a rasping sound that cut through the steady drum of the rain. And although he could feel the cold water already soaking through his socks and wicking up the legs of his pants, he also felt, beneath the discomfort, a thin thread of trust hardening into something like resolve. The moment they left the slight shelter of the cabin and its warped eaves, the full force of the storm hit them, wind knifing across the open space and driving the rain almost sideways, so that it stung his exposed cheeks and scoured the front of his coat in relentless sheets, and as they crossed the invisible line where the yard gave way to the first fringe of trees, the texture of the sound around him shifted violently. The hard surface noise of water on roof and porch, replaced by the wild clatter of drops through leaves and branches, 1,000 tiny impacts that merged into a continuous roar above his head. The scent of the woods under heavy rain was different from the damp he had lived with all week. It was sharper, richer, saturated with fresh sap and torn bark, and the faint mineral bite of soil that had been hidden under dry needles now turned over and exposed. And every breath he drew felt dense with life and decay, and something older than both. The path, if there was a path at all in such conditions, had become a stream, water pooling in every hollow, running down every slight slope, turning the ground into an irregular shifting surface that demanded his full attention. And he knew with a cold, clear certainty that if he had attempted this walk alone, he would already have fallen. A slow, humiliating sprawl into the sucking mud from which he might not have been able to rise. The wolf moved with a kind of grave patience, setting its paws carefully, pausing when it felt his steps falter, sometimes angling its body, so that his knees brushed tree trunks or his boots, found the firmer edge of a submerged rock, instead of plunging straight into an unseen rut, and as he focused on matching its rhythm, he realized that he was breathing not only hard from exertion, but in a different cadence, as if his chest had unconsciously synced itself to the steady rise and fall of the ribs under his hand. At some point, he could not have said where, the practical, immediate part of his mind that monitored each placement of his feet and the distance between his hip and the trunks they passed, gave way to another line of thought entirely, one that had been waiting in the wings of his consciousness since the first howl of the night, and before he could stop himself, he heard his own voice, raw and hoarse in the rain, speaking into the space between his mouth and the wolf's ear. He did not call the animal by any name, because to name it would have been to claim some understanding he did not have, but he spoke as if he were addressing someone who could follow every word, someone who had known him for years, someone who had watched his worst decisions unfold without stepping in, and after the first few sentences. He realized that he was indeed speaking to such a one, though whether that presence sat in the invisible place where his wife's memory lived, or in whatever spirit people had told him kept the mountains themselves standing, or in the deep, unreadable gaze of the creature leading him through the storm, he could not have said. He told the wolf about the night Margaret died, not in the tidy edited version he had allowed himself on other occasions, but in the long, messy sequence it had actually followed, starting with the argument over whether he should make the trip down to Cedar Falls alone for supplies, despite the dark haze already encroaching on his vision, and moving through each stubborn refusal to accept help, each sharp word thrown at her because she had dared to suggest he wait until morning. Each small choice that layered on the next until she had finally grabbed her coat and keys and gone out into the rain herself, muttering that someone in this house had to act like they gave a damn about reality, and how he had stayed planted at the table, fuming and humiliated, nursing his injured pride until a call came from the state trooper 2 hours later, telling him that our truck had gone off the shoulder on a blind curve 3 miles down the mountain. The words came in a stuttering, uneven flow, sometimes breaking off when his boots sank too deep, and he had to wrench it free from the mud with a sucking sound and a sharp, involuntary curse, sometimes tangling together when memory and pain overlapped too tightly for clean narration, but still he forced them out because the storm around them seemed, in some strange way, to demand honesty, to strip away the small polite lies he had told himself for years about the curve being dangerous, about the slickness of the road, about the way headlights could bounce off wet asphalt and trick even good eyes, and leave only the bare ugly fact that if he had listened to her, if he had laid his anger aside long enough to admit he was no longer safe behind the wheel, she would not have been on that road at all. As he spoke, his throat began to ache from the cold air dragging over it, and from the force with which he pressed the confession out, and his body hurt in a dozen different places, his shoulders from bracing against the wind, his calves from compensating for the shifting ground, his hands from gripping fur and cane so tightly that his fingers cramped, yet beneath the physical discomfort, there was a strange spreading sensation that he could only compare, in the fogged corridors of his mind, to the feeling of a tight band being cut, a binding that had constricted his chest for so long, he had forgotten what it was like to draw a breath without that pressure easing, just slightly, with each sentence. The rational part of him knew how such a scene would look from the outside, knew the words people in town might use if they could see him now old, confused, unwell, talking to animals in a storm when he should be safe at home, and he could not entirely silence the clinical voice he had absorbed from pamphlets and murmured doctor talk about aging and perception, the one that suggested gently that a man in his condition, with his history of grief and isolation, might be prone to hearing intention in random sounds and seeing meaning in the indifferent movements of wildlife. That voice whispered at the edges of his awareness, describing neural pathways and coping mechanisms, telling him that to believe the wolf understood him was a step toward delusion, toward the kind of break with reality from which some never quite returned. Against that voice rose another, less articulate but no less real, born of the way the wolf's body had steadied him when the ground tried to pull him down, of the way it paused when his words caught in his throat, as if giving him time to find them again, of the simple, undeniable fact that in a night where a misstep could mean hypothermia and a slow, muddy death, he was not alone. Faith, he thought dimly, might not be about hymns and pews, and the memorized verses he could no longer quite recite in the correct order, but about choosing which voice to follow when the world split into two possible explanations, one that left him abandoned in a mechanical universe, and one that allowed for the possibility that something, whether it wore fur or not, still cared how his story ended. By the time the sound of the spring reached them through the layered roar of the storm, the rain had seeped through every seam of his clothing, turning his shirt and coat into cold, clinging skins that stuck to his back and arms, and his boots squelched with each step, filled with their own small reservoirs of icy water that numbed his toes, yet he felt, tangled up with the exhaustion and the chill, a kind of fierce, stubborn clarity he had not known in years. as if the act of speaking the truth aloud had scraped some of the mildew from the walls of his mind and let a thin shaft of something like light in. The air at the spring was colder still, carrying up from the water's surface a concentrated chill that wrapped around his ankles and wrists like flowing glass. And when the wolf finally stopped, its muscles relaxing under his hand as it settled onto its haunches or belly, he could not tell which from touch alone. He knew without needing sight that they stood once again before the same worn rock and the same small, tireless gush of water that had shaped so many evenings of his marriage. He let go of the fur and reached forward, fingers sliding over wet stone until they found the familiar lip, and then he lowered himself down, his joints protesting louder than they had at the cabin, but obeying nonetheless, and leaned forward until his hands broke the surface of the spring. The water burned with cold, sending spears of sensation up his arms to his elbows, and as he held them there, fists opening and closing reflexively against the current, he found himself speaking again, not about the past this time, but about the fear that had settled over the years like sediment, the fear that Margaret had died hating him. That wherever she was, if she was anywhere at all beyond his own faltering brain, she saw him now as a man who had valued his pride over her safety, who had let anger stand in the doorway when she needed him to be soft. He told the wolf, the spring, the dark, that he did not expect forgiveness, that he did not deserve it, that he would live the rest of his days under the weight of what he had done, but that there was a part of him, small and ashamed, that still longed to hear her say his name without that last edge of exasperation in it. To know that somewhere in the tally of their life, together his stubbornness and his tenderness, his failures and his small daily kindnesses added up to something more than just the way it had ended. The wind shifted suddenly, driving a fresh sheet of rain across the clearing, and in that brief lull before the next gust, he heard something that was not water or weather or his own ragged breathing. A low, almost human murmur that seemed to come from just over his left shoulder, where no one sat. A string of syllables too soft and quick for him to catch individually, but threaded together in a pattern that sounded so like Margaret's voice, when she talked to him half asleep, that his whole body went rigid, his hands clenching in the spring until his knuckles screamed and his nails scraped stone. It could have been the wind funneling through a particular arrangement of branches, could have been some trick of acoustics as rain hit the rocks at a new angle, could have been nothing more than his starved, exhausted brain, finally giving him what it thought he wanted most, and yet the warmth that poured through his chest at the sound felt as real as the ache in his knees, as real as the sting of cold in his fingers. He did not turn his head toward it because there was nothing to see, and he did not call out to it because he had exhausted his words, but he let it wash over him, that half-heard not quite speech, and in its wake there came a loosening, a subtle shift somewhere deep inside him, like ice at the bottom of a river cracking under the pressure of a new thaw. And for the first time since the night of the accident, he allowed himself to consider, not as doctrine, but as a wild private possibility, that he might be something other than the sum of his worst choice, that the love they had shared for so many ordinary years might have more weight in whatever scales counted than the last terrible evening. The rain picked up again, slashing at his face, and the moment passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the steady rush of the spring and the close presence of the wolf, which shifted once, its shoulder brushing lightly against his knee, as if in acknowledgement or simple restlessness, and then went still. He sat there, soaked and shivering, his hands numb in the water, listening to the layered sounds and the layered voices, reason, doubt, hope, memory arguing softly in the back of his skull, and knew that when he stood to make the hard muddy walk back to the cabin, he would carry all of them with him, because no revelation, however sharp, could erase the practical reality of his failing body and the long, lonely stretch of days still ahead. Yet as he finally pulled his hands from the spring and pushed himself upright with a groan that seemed to come from every joint at once, he also knew that something in the road between the cabin and this place had changed, not in the mud or the rocks or the trees, which would continue to shift and fall as weather and time demanded, but in the way he himself walked it. in the fact that he had, for once, stepped into the storm on purpose and spoken aloud the truths he had most wanted to hide, and that whatever the wolf was animal, spirit, fragment of his own splintered mind, it had kept pace with him through every painful step, asking for nothing more than his willingness to move. The knock came in the middle of the afternoon, which in itself was strange enough to put Ezra on edge, because almost no one climbed his hill at that hour any more, not when the price of gas had gone up, and the town's attention had turned inward toward its own slow troubles, and for a moment, as he sat at the table with a half-peeled apple in his hand, and the knife resting against the curve of its flesh, he told himself he had imagined it, that the dull, hollow thud he had heard was just the stove contracting in the cooling air or a loose board in the porch, finally giving up its argument with a bent nail. Then the knock came again, more insistent this time, 3 heavy raps that rattled the thin glass in the window above the sink, and beneath the sound of knuckle on wood he heard the faint shuffle of boots on the porch, and the creak of the step that always announced another person's weight. He wiped his fingers absently on his jeans, the juice from the apple tacky on his skin, and stood, his knees taking a moment longer than he would have liked to straighten. And as he groped for his cane where it leaned against the chair, he felt his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with exertion, because unexpected visitors meant questions, and questions meant lies or truths he was not sure he was ready to share. The cabin smelled of coffee grounds and wood smoke and the faint sour tang of damp that never quite left the boards in autumn, and as he crossed the short distance to the door, he became abruptly aware of how those smells might read to someone coming in from the outside old man, old house, neglect, and he hated, briefly and irrationally, the vulnerability of it. He opened the door to a rush of cold air that carried with it the scent of wet leaves and distant chimney smoke and something sharper, more acrid, that he recognized with a grimace, even before the voices reached him. The stale penetrating stink of tobacco clinging to heavy fabric, the way it soaked into coats and hats and especially leather boots, saturating them so thoroughly that the smell would linger in a room long after the person had gone. And along with that odor came the weight of 2 men on his porch, their presence large enough that he could feel the way they displaced the air, could hear the subtle scuff and crunch, as they shifted their stance on the warped boards. "Afternoon, Mr. Cole," one of them said, the voice low and rough, with the flattened vowels of someone who had lived his whole life within 100 miles of that mountain, and although Ezra could not put a name to it, there was something in the tone, a practiced friendliness stretched thin over a firmer purpose, that made him straighten a little, his hand tightening on the edge of the door. "Afternoon," Ezra replied, his own voice coming out drier than he intended, the word catching in his throat for a moment before he cleared it. "If you're selling something, you're a long hike from the highway." The second man laughed at that, a short breathy sound that carried no real amusement, and the first one shifted his weight again, the heavy soles of his boots grinding small bits of grit into the wood with a crunch that made Ezra's teeth ache, and for a moment no one spoke, the silence filling with the soft rattle of leaves against the side of the cabin and the distant caw of a crow. Then the first man said, "We're not selling anything, sir. Name's Harlan. This here's Vic. We're with the county. Mind if we ask you a couple questions, seeing as you're right up against the woods?" Ezra heard the faint clink of metal as one of them adjusted something on his belt, a set of keys or a buckle or more likely the ring on a holster, because their voices carried that particular calm, prepared edge he had heard in lawmen before, a readiness to act wrapped in casual talk, and he felt an old instinctive resistance climb up his spine, his shoulders pulling tight. Still, he stepped back from the doorway and swung it open wider, because refusing to speak to men with badges, or at least the authority to act as if they carried them, had never ended well for anyone in these hills, and he was too old and too tired to make a stand over something that might still turn out to be nothing. They brought the outside with them as they entered wet air, mud, the sharp stink of smoke that clung to their jackets, and as they crossed his threshold, The familiar music of the cabin changed, the usual creaks and soft ticks of wood, expanding into a fuller, more crowded sound, boots ringing on the floorboards with a weight and rhythm very different from his own shuffling step. One of them brushed against the table, and the knife he had left there rolled with a faint metallic clatter before coming to rest, and he heard the man murmur an apology as he steadied it, his breath close enough for Ezra to smell coffee on it beneath the tobacco, strong and recent, like the brew they served at the diner in town. "We're looking for a wolf," the second man, Vic, said, getting straight to the point in a way Ezra might have appreciated under other circumstances, his voice a bit higher than Harlan's, with an edge of impatience running under it like a fast current beneath slow water. Rabid from the looks of it. Been some talk down in Cedar Falls, a calf torn up on McKendry's place, some tracks closer to the highway than they ought to be, and old Mrs. Raleigh swears something big came up on her porch last week and stared through her screen door until she yelled herself hoarse. Animal control wants eyes on it before somebody really gets hurt, so we've been checking in with folks along the tree line, see if they've heard or seen anything out of the ordinary. At the word rabid, an image flickered unbidden across the dark behind Ezra's eyes, not drawn from any direct memory, but stitched together from old stories and pamphlets, and the occasional late-night news report foam on a muzzle, eyes rolled white, jaws snapping at nothing, a staggering, erratic gait like a drunk trying to outrun his own failing legs. And for a brief, treacherous moment, he saw that picture layered over the warm, steady presence he had followed through storm and fog. The idea of those same jaws, those same eyes, turned toward him in a frenzy that had no room for patience or guidance. The thought made his stomach twist, and he clamped down hard on it, because the animal he knew, if he knew it at all, did not fit that description. Did not move or breathe or even howl like some mindless engine of disease. And yet the stories from town wrapped themselves around his private certainty like barbed wire, complicating it. Harlan shifted again, the leather of his jacket creaking softly, and Ezra caught another whiff of tobacco, the smoke smell fresh and pungent, layered over old sweat and the faint, acrid scent of gun oil. The mix stirring old associations and hymn nights at the VFW hall when he was younger, the click of pool balls, the scratch of matches, and he wondered, in a small detached way, if the two men in his kitchen would smell the same to the wolf, whether the animal, if it crossed their path, would read that complex signature as threat the way Ezra's own body did. He realized slowly that they were waiting for his answer, his silence stretching, and he forced himself to pull his thoughts back from the woods and into the cramped lamplit room. "Wolves stay mostly to themselves up here," he said, choosing his words carefully, measuring each one as if it weighed something. "I've heard howling, same as any man with ears and a roof this close to the trees. The usual sounds, nothing close on the porch, not lately." The lies slid out smoother than he had expected, and its ease unsettled him almost as much as the question itself, because he had always thought of himself as a man who, however stubborn, did not twist the truth without good reason, and now he was bending it in two directions at once, denying what he had experienced to protect a creature he did not fully understand. Vic made a small skeptical noise, the kind a man makes when something does not quite line up with the picture in his head, and ran a hand along the edge of the counter, his fingers drumming a quick restless rhythm on the wood, and the sound carried a faint dryness beneath it, the whisper of calloused skin dragging over old varnish, and Ezra could not help picturing the man's expression. Even though he could not see it, mouth pulled tight, brow furrowed. Eyes sharp as they flicked around the room, taking in details and fitting them into the story he and Harlan had brought up the hill. "You live alone up here," Harlan said, not quite a question, more a confirmation of something they already knew from whatever list had sent them to his door. Hard place to keep an eye on the yard every hour. "You hear anything strange at night, howling close, scratching, something on the boards, you let us know. Rabies doesn't care if a man's minding his own business or not." Ezra thought of the nights when the wolf had come, the heavy, deliberate steps on his porch, the way the boards had registered that weight in his bones, the single unbroken howl that had sounded less like an animal calling its pack, and more like a summons directed at him alone, and he thought, too, of the way the wolf had steadied him on the path when the mud gave way under his boots. How it had held back at the lip of the spring while he poured out the worst of himself into the cold water and the wet air, and a stubborn anger flared up in him at the idea that Harlan and Vic, with their smoke-scented jackets and their cautious, officious voices, might take that presence away in a tangle of traps and bullets. Because someone's calf had been found torn and bloody in a lower pasture. "I'm not deaf yet," he said, more sharply than he meant to, his hand tightening on the cane until the wood pressed a deep groove into his palm. "If something comes this close that doesn't belong, I'll know. You don't need to worry about me." The words teetered on the edge between reassurance and dismissal, and he waited, tense, to see how they would take them. For a moment neither man spoke, and in the small pause the cabin filled with the soft sounds of their presence, the slight shift of cloth as someone adjusted his weight, the almost inaudible exhale of breath through a nose, the tiny crackle of drying mud, flaking off the soles of boots onto the floor. Then Harlan let out a slow breath that tasted of stale cigarette and cold air, and when he spoke again his voice had softened a fraction, taking on the tone of someone who had seen enough of these hills to recognize a particular brand of mountain pride when he heard it. "Fair enough," he said. "Still, we'll be up this way a time or two while this business is going on, checking sign, making sure nothing's sniffing around that shouldn't be. You see tracks in the yard, bigger than a dog, straight, purposeful, not that wandering coyote mess, you might think on giving us a call. We're not out to wipe anything off the mountain, just keep folks safe." The mention of tracks pricked at Ezra like a pin, bringing back into sharp relief the memory of his fingers in those deep hollows in the thin snow, the way the edges had crumbled under his touch, as if the animal had paused there, the size and weight of it undeniable, and the thought that men with guns were now combing the same woods where the wolf moved, reading the same prints with a very different intention, sent a cold thread of dread through him that had nothing to do with rabies. The wolf had saved him once, twice. If it crossed these men with their tobacco-scented coats and their official concern, it might find itself on the wrong end of that concern quickly. He nodded, a small stiff dip of his head that they might or might not see, and said something noncommittal about keeping an eye out, the phrase clumsy in his mouth for a man who had no eyes worth speaking of, and Harlan, perhaps realizing the awkwardness, shifted the subject slightly, asking perfunctory questions about how Ezra was managing, whether he needed anything from town, if Ruth Hadley was still coming up with groceries once a month. Ezra answered as simply as he could, offering them no more of his life than courtesy demanded, and the questions had the hollow ring of a box being ticked, concern expressed to satisfy a policy rather than a heart, and he could not find it in himself to resent that entirely, because he knew they had come for the wolf, not for him. Eventually, the conversation thinned, the words trailing off into repeated assurances and half-formed promises, and he heard them move back toward the door, fabric whispering, boots scraping lightly on the floorboards. The cold slid in again when he opened it for them, the air outside tasting of damp earth, and the faint metallic bite of an approaching weather front, and as they stepped out onto the porch, the boards groaned under their combined weight, the sound traveling up through Ezra's soles into his shins like a tired complaint from the old wood. Out on the porch, their voices dropped, the shapes of their words dissolving into low murmurs that the wind caught and smeared before he could make them out, though he caught enough fragment sign on the Ridge Raleigh's place, don't spook the old-timer to know he had become another small note in their mental ledger, a dot on a map of possible trouble, rather than a man with a story that might complicate the clean lines of their mission. He closed the door after them and stood with his palm flat against the wood, feeling the faint echoes of their footsteps fade from the boards as they went down the steps and across the yard, mud sucking at their boots with wet, reluctant sounds, and the smell of their smoke and gun oil lingered in the cabin even after the outside air had been shut out, threading itself through the more familiar sense like an unwelcome guest refusing to leave. For a long time he did not move, his hands still pressed to the door, as if he could hold it shut against more than just the wind, and in that stillness, the weight of what had just passed settled onto him. Fully the knowledge that the world of men, with its fears and its crude tools for dealing with those fears, had turned its gaze, however briefly, toward the stretch of woods that had become. For reasons he could not articulate without sounding mad, the only place where he felt anything like guidance, and that he had just lied, cleanly and without hesitation, to protect the mysterious source of that guidance. The conflict between the part of him that understood rabies as a real brutal threat and the part that saw in the wolves visits something like a last fragile chance at meaning tugged at him from both sides, and as the quiet of the cabin slowly reassembled itself around the fading scent of tobacco and leather, he found himself listening more intently than ever for any sound at the edge of the woods, wondering which danger would reach his door, first the animal the men feared or the men themselves following its tracks. Chapter 7: The Lost Trail. The first real snow of the season came in during the night without fanfare, no thunder, no dramatic drop in barometric pressure that set the joints to throbbing ahead of time. Only a slow thickening of the air after sundown, and a strange hush that settled over the ridge, as if someone had draped a heavy blanket over the whole mountain. And when Ezra woke in the gray, uncertain morning, he knew before his bare feet touched the floor that the world outside his walls had changed shape. The usual creaks and ticks of the cabin sounded different, muted, and close, as though the sound itself had less room to travel. And when he sat up, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed, the cold that rose from the boards was a cleaner, sharper kind than the damp chill of November, the kind that carried with it the faint tinny taste he associated with metal left out in the frost. He moved slowly, not only because his body demanded it, but because something about the stillness outside made haste feel risky, as if any sudden movement might jar loose whatever fragile balance the night had brought. And when he finally stood and made his careful way to the front door, the familiar landmarks, the rough corner of the dresser, the sag in the third floorboard, the hanging weight of Margaret's coat anchored him more than ever, because in his mind he could already feel the yard buried under a soft, deceptive sameness that erased the paths he knew by heart. When he opened the door, the cold came in like a living thing, sliding under his nightshirt and up his spine with such ruthless efficiency that he sucked in a sharp breath and tasted snow on the air, clean and faintly metallic, laced with the wet, heavy smell of bent pine boughs and the muffled damp of earth sealed beneath a new sheet of white. The sound that greeted him was not absence, but a different kind of presence. The wind, usually a loose, rushing voice moving freely through branches and across open ground, now spoke in smaller, tighter syllables, whistling low along the edges of the roof, and sighing through the gaps in the porch rail where drifts had begun to build. And every noise seemed to come from closer to the cabin, the rest of the world padded in a thick layer that absorbed its own echoes. He stepped out onto the porch, and the boards complained under his weight in their usual way, but the sound was quickly swallowed by the soft, compressing crunch of snow under his socks, a sensation he felt through the thin cotton as a brief resistance, followed by a yielding, a subtle change in pressure that told him the accumulation was already several inches deep. The air had that strange, paradoxical quality of snowy mornings, both painfully cold against any exposed skin and yet somehow muffled, as if even the cold itself had been thickened. And when he reached down and scooped a handful of snow from the railing, the crystals stuck to his fingers before melting, the sting of their chill burrowing quickly into the raw joints of his knuckles. He did not go farther then, because standing on the porch in his nightshirt with the wind threading icy fingers through the thin fabric would have been foolish even for a younger man. But as he shut the door on the white, silenced yard, he carried the knowledge of what lay beyond the walls with him like an extra weight in his chest. Snow hanging on the ground meant more snow to come, his father had said, and the old folks in town had their own set of sayings count how many days the first snow stays, and you'll know how many deep ones are coming. And though Ezra had outgrown the habit of taking such things as prophecy, he could not help feeling that this particular fall, heavy and early and unheralded, had arrived with purpose. The days that followed ran together in a blur of cold and pale light, each morning revealing, through the way the chill moved and the sounds traveled, that the snow had neither melted nor settled into a safe packed crust, but instead layered itself in shifting drifts across the slope, the ground beneath becoming more treacherous with every inch that fell. Smoke from his chimney hugged the cabin low, reluctant to rise, a sure sign, he thought as he wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, that the air up above was holding more weather in its fists. And when he put on his boots and opened the door again on the third day, the snow swallowed his foot almost to the ankle on the first step off the porch, the dry powdery crystals rushing up against the leather with a hiss that made his heart beat a little faster. He did not go to the spring in those first days, did not even consider it, because prudence and the ache in his knees and the memory of the way his breath had burned in his lungs during that storm-soaked confession told him that a blind man alone had no business plowing through fresh snow into the woods without a pressing need. And he tried to convince himself that his stores were sufficient, his water barrels full enough, that there was no reason to test the limits of what his aging body could do. Still, the thought of the spring tugged at him in quieter moments when he sat listening to the slow drip of melt from the eaves during brief week midday thaws, the drops hitting the buried yard with a muffled sound that suggested the snow's depth rather than lessening it, and in those moments he felt, more keenly than he liked, how small his world had become, the cabin, the porch, the path to the woodpile just visible as a slightly more compact line under the drifts. The wolf did not come. Night after night, he lay in his narrow bed and listened to the way the wind changed its tone, as it moved across the snow-covered ridges, sometimes a low continuous moan as it dragged along the frozen surface, sometimes a sudden sharp whistle through bare branches that had been stripped of their last leaves, but no measured footsteps padded across his porch, no single. Solitary howl drew a straight line from the woods to his door. He told himself that it was foolish to expect the animal to appear on command, that creatures of the wild followed cycles and instincts beyond his understanding. And yet with each silent night his chest tightened a little more, the old fear of abandonment and aimless wandering, rising like cold water around his ribs. It was on the fifth day, when the sky had cleared to a bright brittle blue that gave the air a deceptive illusion of warmth, while the temperature under it stayed bitterly low, that necessity finally forced his hand. One of the rain barrels by the side of the cabin, which he used as a backup when the pump handle began to stick, had frozen solid. The water in sight expanded into cloudy, milky ice that pushed outward against the metal ring with ominous creaks, and the pump itself had begun to groan and shudder when he worked it, the flow from the spout sputtering uncertainly. He knew that the spring, sheltered by rocks and the constant movement of its water, would still be running, its surface crusted perhaps with a fragile skin of ice at the edges, but its heart liquid, and the thought of fresh, clear water, after days of coaxing weak trickles from the reluctant pump, took on a sharp, insistent pull in his mind. He dressed in layers, pulling on 2 pairs of socks, the thicker wool ones on the outside, then the thermal long johns he had bought years ago and rarely worn, then his heaviest jeans and flannel, and over all of it, the lined canvas coat whose seams he had reinforced with clumsy stitches the previous winter. He wrapped a scarf twice around his neck and tucked it under his collar, pulled his hat low over his ears, and pulled on his boots, taking his time with the laces, because the stiffness in his fingers made them clumsy, and all the while he argued with himself in a low, steady voice, weighing the risk of a fall, of a twisted ankle, of hypothermia creeping in before he could make it home, against the risk of staying, of letting his world collapse further into the small circle of what he could reach from his chair. The argument ended, as most of his arguments with himself did these days, not with a decisive conclusion, but with exhaustion. He was tired of being afraid of the same things, tired of hearing the same cautious litany in his head, and there was a perverse relief in choosing the danger he could feel under his boots, over the quieter danger of slowly dissolving into the cabin walls. He took his cane in one hand and the empty plastic jug in the other, and opened the door onto a yard transformed into a blank, blinding field of white. Not that he could see it, but could feel the brightness on his skin, a cold, weak radiance that seeped through closed eyelids and made the darkness behind them seem less absolute. The first steps were manageable. The snow in the immediate yard had been broken and compacted somewhat by his trips back and forth to the woodpile, and although it still reached almost to the tops of his boots in places, the underlying ground was familiar, the slope gentle, the distance short. Each step made a soft squeaking crunch, a sound he felt more than he heard, the vibration of compressed crystals traveling up through the soles into his ankles, and the air against his cheeks burned in the way cold air does when it is so dry that each breath seems to scrape the inside of the nose and throat. His breath billowed out in small clouds that he could not see, but could feel as a dampness gathering in the scarf around his mouth, freezing quickly into stiff icy patches that rubbed against his chin. It was only when he reached the place where the packed line of his usual paths ended, at the edge of the yard where the first low bushes of the woods began, their branches bowed under the weight of snow, that the true scale of what he was attempting pressed itself fully upon him. Beyond this point there was no path, no series of compacted steps to follow, only a wide expanse of unbroken snow under trees whose trunks he could not see, and whose spacing he had not traced with his hands in years, and as he took his first step into that untouched drift, the snow swallowed his boot to mid-calf, cold powder flooding over the top and into the shaft to settle wetly against his socks. The shock of cold around his shin made his whole body flinch, and for a moment he stood, leg buried, breathing hard, his cane planted uselessly in the soft stuff a few inches ahead, because there was no solid ground for it to find, only more snow, more uncertain depth. The temptation to turn back, to accept this as a sign that the attempt had been foolish from the start, washed over him in a hot shame-tinged wave. But underneath it lay the stubbornness that had ruined as much in his life as it had saved, the same mulish refusal to accept retreat that had sent him down a wet mountain road with failing eyes all those years ago. And though he recognized the danger of that in himself, he also knew it was the only part of him still strong enough to push against the growing inertia. He lifted his other leg, shook off as much snow as he could, and stepped forward again, this time expecting the deep plunge and the sudden cold, and so the shock was less, though the effort was greater. Each step became a small battle, the muscles in his thighs burning as he fought the resistance of the drifts, his arms aching as he used the cane more as a lever than a feeler, shoving it down and forward to give himself something to haul against, and the jug banged awkwardly against his knee with each lurch, its empty plastic cracking faintly in the brittle air. The woods around him, insulated by snow, offered fewer sounds to guide him than usual. The distant creek was muffled, its rush softened by layers of ice and powder, and even the occasional groan of a tree adjusting to its load came thick and low, robbed of its usual sharpness. He tried to reconstruct the path in his mind, summoning the map he had built in his younger days, and updated with the wolf's guidance in the fog, counting paces, marking the angle of his turns by the feel of the slope under his feet. But the snow blunted those cues, smoothing out the small rises and dips, filling in hollows, and within a dozen steps he realized, with a twist of his gut, that his mental picture and the sensations under his boots no longer matched. The world had become a uniform, gently rolling surface, indistinguishable in any direction, and without the wolf's warm shoulder at his hip or its sure paws finding the safe spots. Every step felt like a blind reach into a box that might hold solid ground or nothing at all. His breath grew harsh in the scarf, each inhale dragging cold air over lungs already irritated by exertion, and a thin high ringing began in his ears, the sound that sometimes came when his blood pressure dipped, or his heart worked harder than it should, a distant metallic whine that made it difficult to tell whether any other noises reached him from the woods. His hands, gloved though they were, started to lose their fine sense of touch, the leather dampening and stiffening, fingertips buzzing with the first blunt ache of cold that had seeped through the fabric, and he knew, in a remote, almost uninterested part of his mind, that these were not good signs for a man his age this far from guaranteed shelter. He stumbled when his right boot, instead of meeting packed snow, sank suddenly into nothing, the world dropping away under his foot, as if the earth itself had decided to step back, and for a sickening instant he hung off balance, his center of gravity tilted over a void his cane had not found in time. The snow at the edge of the hidden hole crumbled under his weight, cascading down in a soft rush that filled his left boot as it slid, and then he was falling, his arms flailing in the cold air, the jug flying from his hand and vanishing somewhere into the white, his cane skittering away with a faint receding hiss. The impact when he hit bottom drove the breath out of him in a harsh grunt, the air leaving his lungs in a cloud he felt explode against the wool of his scarf, and for a long moment he lay there, stunned, the world narrowed to the sharp pain in his ribs and hip, where they had struck concealed rock under the cushion of snow, the cold pressing against him from all sides, as loose powder slid down into the hollow and settled in a fine, suffocating layer over his legs and arms. The hole was not deep enough to bury him, not yet, but it was deep enough that the walls of snow around him rose to his chest when he tried to sit, slick and treacherous, offering no purchase to his gloved hands, and as he pushed against them his fingers slid, sending more snow down into his collar, icy crystals melting against the heated skin of his neck, and between his shoulder blades. His heart pounded in his ears, a heavy muffled drum that threatened to drown out thought, and he had to force himself to breathe slowly, in and out, counting the inhales under his breath to keep panic at bay, because panic would make his movements jerky and waste the little energy he had. The cold was already working its way in, not just as a sharp sting now, but as a deeper, more insidious numbness creeping up from his feet and into his calves, a dulling of sensation that his mind, trained by long winters and doctors' warnings, recognized as the first gentle hand of hypothermia, the one that comes before the violent shivering and the bone-deep confusion. He tried to roll onto his stomach to get his knees under him, but the space was too tight, the snow too soft. Each attempt to push up simply shifted more of the white stuff, undermining his brace and sending him sliding back down, and with each failure a little more of his heat bled into the frozen ground, the contact stealing warmth from his spine and shoulders. The absence of his cane, the knowledge that it lay somewhere above him on the surface where he could not reach it, left him feeling oddly naked, as if he had been stripped of an extra limb, and the realization that no one knew he was out here, that no one was due to check on him for days, perhaps weeks, pressed down on his chest with almost physical weight. He called out once, his voice cracking in the cold air, the sound swallowed quickly by the snow-dampened woods, and the smallness of it against the vastness around him, a single hoarse shout lost under the breath of the mountain, made something inside him give a tiny fracture in the stubborn shell that had held him upright through so many smaller indignities. He thought with a sudden bitter clarity that this was how it would end after all, not in a bed with Ruth holding his hand or in his sleep, with his face turned toward the comfortless glow of a dead bulb, but in a shallow hole at the edge of a path he could no longer find, the snow filling slowly around him like sand in an hurglass. For a moment, as the cold worked its way deeper and his muscles trembled with the effort of each futile attempt to climb, his mind flickered through the usual rationalities, no one to blame but himself, old fool in the snow. This is what comes of stubbornness, and then, almost without his willing it, his thoughts reached for the wolf, for the memory of heavy fur under his hand. And the steady living warmth of a body pressed against his, when the mutt had tried to drag him down. It was ridiculous to think of it now, he told himself, absurd to expect the same impossible mercy twice, and yet the image rose stubbornly, filling the dark behind his eyes, and with it there came, in defiance of the creeping numbness, a raw, almost childlike desire not to die alone, not to be buried unseen in this narrow frozen pocket of earth. He did not call its name because he had never given it one, and he did not howl because his throat was too raw and his breath too shallow. But he whispered, his voice scraping against the dry air, A few cracked words that were not a prayer in any church sense, and yet carried the same desperate incision "I'm here," and the sound of them, small and rough as they were, seemed to do something in him, to mark a line between lying down and letting the snow close over his face, and digging his gloved fingers into the cold walls again, even though they slipped. Time stretched in strange ways in the hollow, the minutes lengthening and folding over each other, so that he could not have said whether he lay there 10 minutes or 40. Only that at some point the violent shivers began, his muscles jerking in hard involuntary spasms that made his teeth rattle and his jaw ache, and that the shivers, uncomfortable as they were, brought with them a grim reassurance, because as long as he shook this way his body was still trying to fight, still burning what little fuel he had left to keep his core from dropping into the deeper, more dangerous cold. His thoughts grew fuzzy at the edges, sliding away from the clear focus he tried to pin them with, and more than once he felt an odd seductive lassitude tug him towards stillness, a whisper that it would be easier to simply stop moving, to let the cold numb not only his limbs, but the restless swirl of his mind. It was in the middle of one of those shuddering, unfocused moments that he felt, more than heard, a change at the edge of the hollow, a subtle shift in the weight of the air above him. The way sound returned from the snow, as if something large had stepped close and displaced it. A soft scattering of loose crystals drifted down onto his face, stinging the exposed skin of his cheeks, and then there was a pause, a held breath, and the next sensation was a new weight on the snow just above his shoulder, firm and deliberate, followed by the scrape of claws biting into the packed side of the hollow, as if testing its integrity. A warm, damp breath touched the side of his frozen neck, cutting through the numbness there like a sudden brand, and though his body was too clumsy now for sudden movements, his heart surged painfully in his chest, his ribs aching around it as it slammed against them, because he knew, without needing to see, what shape cast that faint shadow over his small snowy pit. The night he finally let the words pour out of him like something broken in the attic, giving way under too much weight, began quietly enough, with the kind of still hard cold that turned the air to glass and made every small sound ring sharper than it should, and as Ezra moved about the cabin, his hands finding their way by habit from stove to table to shelf, he could feel the temperature in the boards under his feet dropping by tiny degrees, each one another bead on the string of a winter that seemed determined to stretch longer and tighter around the ridge than any in recent memory. The snow outside had settled into a crust that crunched faintly under the paws and hooves and boots that crossed it, the earlier softness compacted by days of weak sun and colder nights, and the sky, though he could not see it, pressed down in that particular way it did, when the stars were stark and the clouds nowhere to be found, the radiating heat of the earth leaking straight up into a clear, uncaring dark. Inside, the cabin's smells layered over each other in a familiar way: old pine boards warmed by the stove, a faint sour tang from damp wool drying near the fire, the ghost of coffee lingering from the afternoon, and as he knelt by the wood box, fingers closing around the split logs, feeling their rough fibrous surfaces and the occasional sticky patch of sap, he thought, not for the first time, how these small tasks had become almost sacramental to him, each one an offering to the bare fact of staying alive another day. He built the fire with the same care he always had, arranging kindling in a loose, careful lattice, the sticks dry enough that they rattled slightly when he set them down, then laying the thicker pieces across them in a crisscrossed pattern that his father had taught him long ago, and when he struck the match, the sulfur bit his nose in a sharp, brief flare, before the thinner wood caught, the first tongues of flame licking up with a soft, eager hiss. As the fire grew, the sounds in the small room changed. The crackle of burning sap in the logs added an irregular percussion to the background hush, little pops and sighs that punctuated the steady hum of the chimney drawing, and the heat began to move out across the floor in slow waves, pushing back the edges of the cold that seeped through the walls. The light, dim and flickering, painted warmth onto his closed eyelids, and even though that glow meant nothing to his ruined sight, he turned his face toward it out of habit, feeling the slight difference in temperature on his skin, the way one cheek grew warmer than the other as he sat sideways to the hearth. He had not expected the wolf that night, after the desperate rescue from the snow-filled hollow and the slow, painful days that followed, during which his body had alternated between the bone-deep ache of bruised ribs and the strange, treacherous fatigue that comes after a brush with cold too close to the core. He had told himself that the animal, whatever its nature, had done enough, had answered his whispered call in the drift at a cost he could not measure, and would now fade back into the larger, indifferent rhythm of the woods. Yet some part of him, the same part that made him sit up straighter when the house creaked in a particular way or when the wind shifted suddenly against the siding, pricked at changes in the air that went beyond temperature. And tonight, as he settled on the low stool near the fire, his hands extended to let the heat work its way into his stiff fingers, that part of him stirred at a faint tremor in the floorboards, a breath in the walls that did not belong to settling wood. At first, the sound was so soft he might have missed it if the fire had been roaring louder, a slight, almost tentative creak on the porch, followed by another, weight tested carefully on a familiar step, and his heart, which had finally begun to beat at a calmer rhythm after the exertion of bringing in wood, gave one hard, painful thump, as if reminding him that it, too, was an old organ not built for endless surprises. The air near the door cooled a fraction as the outside cold pressed against it, and in the small pause between one log shifting in the grate and the next, he thought caught the distant echo of a single, low whine, not a full howl, just a breath of sound that came and went so quickly he could have dismissed it as wind if he had wanted to. He did not stand right away because rising had become a deliberate act that required him to think his way through the movement, brace hands on knees, lean forward, engage unwilling thigh muscles. But the knowledge that the wolf was there, just beyond the thin barrier of wood and cheap lock, pulled at him with a force that made the stiffness in his joints easier to push through. When he did get to his feet, the blood rushed in his ears, bringing with it a brief dizziness, and he stood for a second with one hand on the back of the chair, feeling the worn edge under his palm until the room steadied around him. Then he moved toward the door, his steps slow but sure, the cane lying forgotten against the wall, and as he reached for the knob, his heart rolled in his chest with a complicated mixture of dread and something almost like anticipation. The cold that came in when he opened the door was a sharp, immediate knife, but it stopped at the threshold, blunted by the wave of heat rolling out from the fire behind him. And between those two competing temperatures stood the wolf, its presence a dense solid shape in the doorway of his perception, displacing air in a way no drift of snow or stack of whatever could. He could not see its outline, the arch of its back, or the set of its ears, but he felt the weight of it in the way the floorboards underfoot seemed to register its pause with subtle responsive creaks, and in the way the smell of the night, cold, dry, carrying the faint mineral tang of distant ice, and the sharper note of old snow was pierced by a warmer, muskier scent, the animal's own, edged with the faint lingering trace of forest and blood, and something wild that no amount of human vocabulary had ever really pinned down. Come in, then he heard himself say, the words strange in his mouth, because he had never invited it before, had always stepped out into its world, instead of bringing it into his, and even as he spoke he wondered, with a small wry twist of unease, what it meant to open his last safe space to something that existed so firmly outside the narrow boundaries of his control. The wolf did not need the invitation. It would have crossed the threshold if it had wanted to, with or without his consent. But when he stepped back, making room, it moved forward with a slow measured step, claws ticking lightly on the worn wood, and as it passed him its flank brushed his leg, the contact brief and surprisingly gentle. The fur thick and cool near the surface and warm beneath. He shut the door behind them, the latch clicking into place with a small definite sound, and for a moment the three of them, old man, wolf, fire, stood enclosed in the same warm flickering air, the crackle and pop of sap in the logs, filling the silence between their breaths. The smell of smoke and dry wood, of burning resin and singed fibers, wrapped around the more pungent animal scent, softening it without erasing it. And Ezra, standing with one hand still on the door, felt his throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the dryness of winter air, because in that mingling of odors and sounds, there was something like the feeling of a long empty pew suddenly occupied again. He moved back toward the hearth, his steps cautious but unhurried, and when he reached the stool, he lowered himself onto it with the care of a man who has learned the hard way that a careless sit can send a fresh bolt of pain up a spine that no longer forgives. The wolf followed, its footfalls a soft counterpoint to the crackling fire, and settled itself near him, not so close that its fur brushed his leg, but near enough that the radiating heat from its body, joined with the warmth of the flames, to create a pocket of almost extravagant comfort in a room where, hours earlier, his breath had hung faint and white in the air. For a while, neither of them moved much. The wolf lay with its head on its paws, or perhaps with its chin stretched along its forelegs, he could not tell, but he heard the slow, even pull and release of its breathing, the occasional faint twitch of skin, as a stray ember popped or a draft shifted, and Ezra sat with his hands extended toward the fire, feeling the skin of his palms grow hot, and then easing them back a little, rotating his wrists to warm the backs of his fingers. The flames made a constant low roar under the sharper cracks and snaps, a sound that, in its steady rise and fall, smoothed some of the rough edges inside his chest. And though he had always found watching a fire soothing when his eyes still worked, he realized now that listening to it offered its own kind of comfort. The way it engaged every remaining sense at once, the warmth on his skin, the dry woody scent, the hypnotic chorus of noises that never exactly repeated. It was into that cushion of warmth and sound that the first words of his confession finally fell, almost before he knew he had decided to speak. He started not with the broad statements he had rehearsed silently for years. "I am sorry, it was my fault, I should have listened," but with a small, oddly specific memory, the way Margaret's hand had felt on his shoulder the morning after the doctor first told him that the clouds at the edges of his vision were not going to clear, that the world would narrow and narrow until it was gone, her thumb pressing a slow, steady circle into the muscle as he sat in the parking lot, pretending to search for his keys, so the nurse would not see the tears standing stubbornly on his lower lids. He described that touch, the warmth and the weight, and the way it had said, without words, that she was there and would stay, and as he spoke his voice came rough at first, scratched up by disuse and the rawness of winter air, but it smoothed a little as he went on, not because the pain lessened, but because the act of shaping it into sentences gave it a channel narrower than the wide formless flood it had been in his head. The wolf did not move or make any sound that a skeptical mind could have taken as response. It lay and breathed, and occasionally shifted its paws against the floor with a faint rasp of claws on wood. And yet every time he faltered, searching for the next image, the next piece of the long tangled story he had never dared tell another living soul, he felt, in some strange way, as if he were being listened to, as if the space around him were not indifferent but gently attentive, like the quiet in a church when the congregation leans forward without realizing it. He went past the doctor's office into the small daily humiliations that had followed the time he had knocked over a display in the grocery store, and heard the sharp, irritated sigh of the cashier, the way neighbors' voices had taken on a certain careful brightness when they offered rides, a kindness that tasted of pity to him. The slow erosion of his usefulness as the man who fixed things, carried heavy loads, drove into town without a second thought. He spoke of the way that erosion had eaten at him, had turned him inward and sharp-edged, and how Margaret had borne the brunt of that turning, catching the shrapnel of his anger in the kitchen and the bedroom and the car, until the day it had solidified into that terrible argument, the one he had already told in outline but now filled in with color and smell. And sound the slam of the cupboard door, the smell of stew burning faintly on the stove while they shouted. The way the rain had hammered against the windows, as if anxious to be let in. He did not spare himself in the telling. He repeated the exact phrases he had hurled at her, crude and petty and unfair, described the way her face had tightened with hurt and then hardened into something flinty, The set of her shoulders as she grabbed her keys, the echo of her boots on the porch as she left, and his own stubborn refusal to go after her, to call her back. Even his step out onto the porch in the rain and watch her taillights disappear, because he had been so sure of his rightness, of the principle of the thing, that he could not bring himself to bend. The words shook in his throat as he spoke them, not with theatrical emotion, but with the deep plain tremor of a man trying not to look away from the worst thing he has done, and the firelight, unseen by him, threw his shadow long and broken across the walls, a dark shape that flickered in time with the flames. As he talked, the room grew warmer, not only from the fire, but from the simple accumulation of his own breath and the wolf's, and a fine sheen of sweat began to gather at the nape of his neck under his collar, cooling quickly whenever a stray draft brushed past, and sending a small shiver down his spine. The smell of the wolf grew stronger as it warmed in the confined space, a rich animal odor that carried hints of damp fur and old blood, and something faintly sharp, like crushed pine needles and iron, and instead of repelling him, it somehow grounded him, tethering his spinning thoughts to the solid reality of another beating heart in the room. When he finally reached the part of the story where the phone had rung, its shrill cry cutting through the slow, sulky ticking of the clock and the irregular drumming of rain on the roof, his voice dipped lower, the words coming slower, as if they had to fight their way through thicker layers of memory. He described the feel of the receiver in his hand, slick from the sweat of his palm, even before the trooper's voice on the other end began to speak, and the way the words lost control and wet wrote and we did all we could. Ads seemed to arrange themselves in the air between his ear and his brain without meaning at first, just sounds, until they clicked into place, and left behind only the image of Margaret's body, her hair damp and tangled, her eyes closed not in sleep, but in that terrible, unnatural stillness that no amount of shaking could break. He spoke of the funeral he had not attended because by the time Ruth had made it up the mountain to tell him, his world had already narrowed so violently that the thought of stepping into a room full of people who would look at him and see, not a man in mourning, but the man who had let his wife drive alone in a storm, had been more than he could bear. He told the wolf about the way he had sat instead on the porch that day, feeling the chills seep up through the boards into his bones, listening to the wind move through the pines with an aimless, restless sound, and how every gust had felt like a question he could not answer. The words tumbled out of him in long, uneven stretches, sometimes spilling over each other in his haste to outrun the images they summoned, sometimes halting for whole minutes, while he swallowed against a lump in his throat or rubbed at his face with the heel of his hand, surprised to find it wet. He did not ask for forgiveness with any formal phrase. The idea of that still felt too large, too presumptuous, as if he would be trying to pull something clean and whole over a mess that would never really dry. But the shape of the plea lay under everything he said, a raw pulsing undercurrent. See me, know what I did, understand that I have carried it, that I am still carrying it, that I do not know how to put it down. The wolf shifted once, close enough that its fur brushed lightly against his boot, a barely there contact that nonetheless sent a small electric jolt up his leg, and then it resettled, the soft thump of its body on the floor, an oddly reassuring sound. Its breathing remained slow and steady, unhurried, and in that unhurriedness he found, absurdly, a kind of acceptance, as if the animal, by not flinching or snarling or rising to leave, was granting him the right to speak his shame aloud without immediate judgment. When his voice finally trailed off, worn down to a rasp and emptied of specifics, the cabin fell into a deep layered quiet, the kind that exists only in places where outside and inside silence meet and settle on each other like overlapping sheets. The fire had burned down to a bed of coals that gloat unseen, their crackle softer now, more like the faint shifting of someone turning over in sleep than the earlier exuberant pop of sap. And the room's warmth had taken on a thicker, drowsier quality, the air holding heat in a way that made his eyelids feel heavier than they had any right to. Ezra sat with his elbows on his knees and his head bowed, the heels of his hands pressed against his eye sockets in an old feudal gesture, and he felt the emptiness that comes after a long spill of words, a hollowed-out tiredness that was not unpleasant, exactly, but left him aware of how thin the boundary was between himself and the dark, pressing against the cabin walls. He did not feel absolved. There was no sudden lightness in his chest, no dramatic sense of burden lifted, and he would not have trusted such a feeling if it had come, because he knew too well that some weights embed themselves too deep to be dislodged by a single night's honesty. What he did feel, there by the fire with the wolf's steady presence soaking into the edges of his awareness, was a small surprising loosening, as if the story he had carried alone for so long had, in being spoken aloud, shifted from a solid stone in his gut to something slightly more porous, something that allowed a thin trickle of warmth to seep through. The promise of forgiveness, if there was any in that room, did not come in the form of words or visions or some grand comforting sign, but in the simple continuity of the wolf's breathing and the steady warmth of the coals, in the way the cabin held around him without judgment, its walls neither leaning in to crush nor falling away to expose. He sat there until his back ached from the hunched posture and his legs tingled with pins and needles, and only when his head began to nod forward in small involuntary jerks did he finally push himself up, one hand on the stool, the other briefly, instinctively, brushing along the wolf's shoulder, fingers sinking once more into that dense living fur, taking from it a last small measure of borrowed strength before he turned toward the narrow bed that waited in the next room and the long, uncertain stretch of days beyond the reach of this particular fire's light. By the time winter began, in its own quiet, relentless way, to loosen its grip on the ridge, the snow no longer fell in heavy, suffocating sheets, but in thin drifting veils that the wind worried along the ground, and the ice on the creek had started to fracture into narrow, shining seams that caught what little light there was and held it trembling. The air still bit at any exposed skin, sharpening breath into small puffs that vanished almost as soon as they appeared, yet beneath that bite lay a different note now, a faint hint of moisture and thaw, the promise of mud and running water, and the slow, messy business of the world waking up. Ezra felt a change before he could have named it, in the way the cold moved differently through the cabin, not as a solid, impenetrable wall, but as something that came in pulses, receding slightly in the afternoon, only to creep back harder toward dawn, and in the way the smoke from his chimney, which had hugged the roof all through the deep months, now rose a little higher before flattening out along the slope. His body did not wake with the season. If anything, the hard weeks behind him had ridden themselves more deeply into his bones than any previous winter, and each morning, when he swung his legs over the edge of the bed and set his feet on the floor, there was a suspended moment in which he did not know whether his knees would hold, whether the thin architecture of muscle and tendon and old injury would consent to bear him upright again. The fall into the snow hollow, the long shivering recovery, the nights by the fire telling the wolf more than he had ever meant to say aloud, had left him with a fatigue that was not just tiredness, but a kind of worn-through feeling, as if the fabric of him had been rubbed too many times over the same rough place, and now the threads gaped. He noticed, too, that the world sounded farther away than it had before, the ordinary noises of the ridge, the creek's rush, the distant chainsaw at a neighbor's woodlot, the occasional car laboring up the main road, all seeming to come from a little farther down a tunnel, muffled by some layer he could not quite identify. His fingers, when he held them up before his face, though he could not see them, tingled at the tips more these days, a persistent buzzing that the doctor in town, on his last visit months ago, had called circulation issues, and had spoken about with the vague, helpless tone people used when they had no real remedy to offer. His memory, too, had begun to fray in new ways. Sometimes he would reach for the kettle and find himself holding the coffee tin instead, or he would set down his cane in one room and spend long minutes tracing the edges of the furniture with his hands, puzzled by its absence, only to discover it leaning against the doorframe where he had left it not half an hour before. The wolf had not come back since the night of the fire and the confession, and Ezra had decided, with a mixture of resignation and gratitude, that this was fitting, that whatever thread had bound them together had been drawn as tight as it could be and then gently, carefully let go. He told himself on the better days that the animal had its own life to live, its own paths to follow, that it had given more of itself to his stumbling human story than any wild creature owed, and that to expect its continued presence would be a kind of greed, an unwillingness to accept that mercy, if that was what it had been, often came once rather than on demand. On worse days, when the wind hammered at the cabin and the nights stretched long and featureless, and his breath rattled loud in his own ears, he wondered if he had said something wrong, if his stumbling attempts at honesty had somehow offended whatever moved behind the wolf's eyes, and the old familiar guilt twisted itself into new shapes to accommodate this fresh uncertainty. As winter's edges blurred, the cabin's interior shrank around him in an odd paradoxical way. The knowledge that the world outside was beginning to change, that the snow would soon recede from the roots of the trees, and the first damp sense of thawing soil and rotting leaves would rise, made the confines of his 4 rooms more stifling, not less. And there were mornings when the very sound of the kettle's whistle or the pump's groan felt like someone tapping on his skull from the inside. The path to the woodpile, now a narrow muddy trench between stubborn drifts, took more out of him each time he walked it, his boots sinking and sticking in the heavy half-melted snow, the cold water seeping in around the seams and gnawing at his toes, and more than once he had to stop halfway, one hand braced on the side of the shack, chest heaving. The taste of iron in his mouth. It was on one such morning when the sky outside pressed low and gray, and the snowpack had become a dirty pitted thing, scarred by old footprints and streaked with wind-blown debris, that the thought of the spring rose in him not as a gentle tug, but as a clear hard fact, the way a word sometimes appears in the mind fully formed, with no memory of how it began. He had not been down there since the storm night of his confession. The deep snow and his own injuries had made the idea impossible in the weeks that followed. And then, as the winter wore on, a kind of inertia had set in, a belief that he had already taken from that place all it had left to give. Yet now, as he stood at the window with his hand resting on the cold glass, feeling the faint vibration of the wine through his palm, he understood with a sudden, calm certainty that he needed to go back, not for water the pump, grudging and uneven though it was, still produced enough for his needs, but for something else, something that had begun down there and had never quite finished. The knowledge did not come with trumpets or voices or any of the dramatic signs he had half expected in the long, dull reaches of his grief, but it settled into him with the inevitability of weather, a front moving through, and once it was there, it reorganized his thoughts around itself with a quiet efficiency. He sat at the table and counted, not days or months this time, but capacities how far he could walk before his knees screamed, how long his lungs could work hard before the ringing in his ears thickened into blackout, how many times he could afford to stumble and haul himself up again, before the old ache in his ribs sharpened into something worse. He nodded to himself when he had finished, a small, almost imperceptible dip of the head, and though there was no one in the room to see it, the gesture felt like agreement, a man signing his name at the bottom of a document he had taken time to read. He did not wait for a clearer day, for a thaw that might make the going easier, because he knew that waiting had become, in his life, a way of not doing, a way of letting decisions dissolve into a haze of maybe and not yet, until circumstance made them for him. Instead, he chose the next morning, which arrived gray and sharp, the temperature low enough that the half-melted snow had crusted over during the night, its surface now a fragile brittle shell that would support his weight for 1 or 2 steps, before breaking with a sudden jarring collapse. He dressed with the same care he had taken before, layering clothes, pulling wool over thin shins, tugging his hat down until it covered the tops of his ears. But there was a different quality to his movements now, a deliberateness that had more in common with ritual than with simple preparation, as if each button done up, and each lace tied in marked another small ascent. The cabin, when he stood in the middle of it for what might be the last time, felt both heartbreakingly familiar and strangely distant. The objects he had worn smooth with his hands over the years, the table's scarred edge, the back of Margaret's chair, the cool curve of the pump handle reduced to their simple shapes and textures, stripped of the narratives he had wrapped around them. The air inside held the usual mix of wood smoke and old coffee and the shadow of tobacco from the hunter's visit weeks ago, but he did not linger over those scents, did not try to imprint them on some inner archive. He had lived inside them for so long that they were stitched into him already, and he understood at some deep animal level that the part of him that mattered now was not the one that collected details for later remembrance, but the one that could still move his feet. He took his cane and, after a moment's hesitation, the empty jug as well, more out of habit than necessity, the plastic knocking lightly against his leg as he walked to the door. When he opened it, the cold met him with the blunt, unornamented honesty of late winter, no longer the novelty of the first snows nor the vicious, knife-edged hostility of deep January, but a steady, insistent chill that had nothing to prove, and no energy to spare for dramatics. The yard lay still under its patchy skin of crusted snow, the footprints of deer and raccoon and stray dogs, printed and reprinted in overlapping patterns that he could not see, but could sense in the subtle irregularities under his boots. As he stepped out here, a slight sag where something heavier had passed, there a crisp, unbroken span. He did not expect the wolf to be waiting, and it was not. The space before the porch, the air along the path to the tree line, held only the faint smells of recent animal passage, and the thin metallic hint of melting ice, and the only sounds reaching him were the low murmur of the stubborn creek and the occasional distant drip as old snow let go of branches. He felt, briefly, the ghost of disappointment touch his chest, a small cold thumb pressed just under the breastbone, but it faded quickly because he had already told himself, in that careful, pragmatic way he had developed for talking to his own fears, that this walk was his, that whatever had been done with the wolf's help before had brought him to this point precisely so he could choose to go without it. The path into the woods was both easier and harder than it had been in deep winter. The snowpack, though diminished and crusted, still hid the worst of the rocks and roots, smoothing the ground into something like a negotiable surface. Yet the crust's unpredictability, bearing his weight one moment and giving way the next, kept his muscles tensed, his steps cautious, each placement of his cane a test rather than a reassurance. The air carried the smells of thawing things, old leaves turning to dark, rich mush under the remaining snow, damp bark, the faint sour notes of small creatures long dead now revealing themselves as the white blanket receded, and those scents rose into him with a bittersweet familiarity, echoes of other years when he had walked these same woods full-sighted and younger, stepping over roots with an easy stride instead of feeling for them like hazard. The silence around him was not absolute. There were small sounds everywhere, magnified by his dependence on them, the creak of a branch as it shed its load, the soft, almost apologetic collapse of a clump of snow falling from a rock, the tentative calls of birds testing the air, yet beneath those lay a broader, deeper hush, the kind that stretches over a landscape at the end of something, not quite giving way yet to the busy noise of beginnings. Each breath he took felt cool and thin in his lungs, and after a while a dull ache began behind his breastbone, the old lingering reminder of years of cigarettes he had quit too late, and he had to slow his pace, counting his inhalations in time with the swing of his cane, to keep himself from panting. He lost the exact line of the path more than once. The snow, though thinning, still covered enough of the ground to obscure the narrow track he had once known by heart, and without the wolf's sure body to lean into, he found himself drifting at slight angles, correcting when the slope under his feet told him he had veered too far in one direction. Once he walked face first into the low icy branches of a fir, the needles scratching his cheeks and catching at his hat, showering cold water down his neck as they snapped back, and he stood for a moment, startled, wiping at the wet trickle with a gloved hand, then laughed, a low breathless huff that steamed in the air and surprised him with its own dry humor. As he went deeper, the sounds of the cabin, the memory of the kettle's whistle, the stove's ticking cooling fell away behind him, replaced by the constant soft crunch of his boots through the crust and the quiet thud of his cane. His mind, which had whirled restlessly in the cabin, listing grievances and regrets and small sharp fears, began to quiet as well, not into any sort of blankness, but into a cleaner, narrower focus that rested on the immediate demands of the walk, where to place his foot, how far to reach with the cane, how to adjust his weight when the crust broke under him without wrenching his knee. Thoughts of Margaret came and went like breaths. He saw her in that private inward way that no blindness could erase, sitting with her feet in the spring, water swirling around her ankles. Her head tipped back as she laughed at something he had said, and the image walked alongside him, not as an accusation now, but as a presence, a steady companion matching his pace. The closer he came to the spring, the more he felt, even without sight, the subtle changes in the air that had always marked the place. The temperature dropping a degree or two as the cold water's breath seeped up the ravine, the scent of stone and mineral sharpening under the loam and rot, the way sound shifted, the creek's diffuse murmur consolidating into a more focused rush. The ground under his boots began to slope more sharply, and he slowed, testing each step, feeling for the familiar boulder that marked the start of the last descent. When his cane finally knocked against it with a hollow, satisfied tap, a small, unexpected tenderness moved through him, as if he had reached out into the dark and found an old friend's shoulder exactly where he remembered it. He traced the edge of the rock with his free hand, fingers gliding over the cold, damp surface, and found the worn groove where his own palm had rested so many times before, either in youth, steadying himself as he swung down to the lower ledge, or more recently with the wolf's weight at his side and his confession spilling into the storm. He eased himself around it, feeling for the drop to the narrow shelf where he knew he could kneel, and when his boot found the familiar ridge he let his body sink into it, his joints protesting but obeying, until he was balanced in that precarious, careful way that had become his second nature. The sound of the spring was right in front of him now, its voice unchanged by the winter, and his own long, complicated year a steady, incessant rush that had nothing to do with human concerns, carving its own small path through rock and time. He reached down, slowly, aware of how easily a slip here could send him forward into the pool, cold water closing over him in an instant his old heart might not withstand. And when his fingers finally broke the surface, the shock of it struck all the way up his arms. A fierce, clear cold that was as far from the muffled chill of snow as a clean blade is from a blunt stone. He held his hands there, immersed to the wrists, feeling the water slide over his skin, around his knuckles, through the spaces between his fingers, and as he did he let his shoulders drop, the muscles along his spine loosening in a way they had not in months. The air around him was very still. Whatever wind had been moving through the higher branches did not penetrate this small hollow, and the only sounds he could hear were the spring's rush, his own slow breathing, and a faint high note that he realized after a moment was the almost inaudible ringing in his ears, the backdrop to his days now that he normally ignored. He listened to all of it as if it were a kind of music, simple and austere, and felt, in the deep quiet center of himself, a sense of arrival that had nothing to do with geography. He did not speak much. He had said most of what he needed to say on the night by the fire, his voice shredding itself on the jagged edges of truth, and he had no wish to dilute that with repetition. Instead, he murmured a few plain words, not strung into any formal prayer, just small acknowledgments directed toward the water, toward the unseen trees, toward Margaret, wherever or whatever that meant now, and perhaps, though he did not frame it so consciously, toward the wolf that had brought him here the first time he could no longer find the way. He thanked, in the blunt language of a man unused to gratitude, the stubbornness that had kept him alive long enough to reach this place soberly instead of by accident or rescue, and he admitted equally bluntly that he was tired, that the prospect of more winters and more half-lit days in the cabin did not stir in him the old reflexive clutching at life. The cold in his hands became, after a while, not pain but a kind of numb solidity, as if the water had turned his skin to stone up to the wrists, and he drew them out, letting droplets run down his sleeves into the wool, seeping chill into his forearms. He set his palms flat on the rock beside him, feeling its coarse grain bite gently into the pads of his fingers, anchoring him, and tilted his face up, though there was nothing for his eyes to find. The air on his cheeks felt different upturned than it had when his head was bowed, cooler and thinner, and in that small shift he had the odd sensation of being very slightly lifted, as if some infinitesimal weight had been removed from the top of his skull. For a fleeting second, so brief he could have dismissed it as the mind's trick, he felt it a presence close beside him on the narrow ledge, the faint depression of weight on the rock, the almost soundless exhale of breath that brushed his sleeve, stirring the damp fabric. There was no telltale creak of paws on stone, no jingle of tags or gear, nothing he could point to and say, "Here, this proves it," yet the sensation was as real to him as the cold under his hands, and instead of reaching out, instead of trying to clutch at it as he might have earlier in the year, he simply smiled, the expression small and unshowy, tugging gently at the deep lines at the corners of his mouth. "You're late," he said softly, his voice hardly louder than the spring, and the words carried no accusation, only a weary affection, the way a man might chide an old friend who has taken the long route on purpose. His chest, which had felt tight and sore for so long he could barely remember a time when each breath did not drag, loosened on the exhale, and the next inhale slit in a little more easily, as if the air itself had thinned just enough to be more generous. He sat like that for some time, his body gradually informing him, through a series of small insistent pangs and tremors, that had reached the limit of what it could comfortably endure in that position, knees throbbing, back beginning to seize, fingers stinging as the cold from the water spread further up his arms, but the signals seemed distant now. Like messages sent from a far-off station, he had no obligation to answer quickly. The world around him, the steady water, the damp rock, the damp raw smell of late snow and emerging earth, wrapped him in a quiet that felt less like absence than like a held breath, and in that quiet he recognized, with a kind of startled calm, that he was not afraid. When he finally eased himself to his feet, using the rock as leverage, his limbs shook with the effort, and black flecks danced at the edges of the darkness behind his eyes, yet the dizziness felt almost familiar, like the sway of a boat he had been on before. He knew, in a practical way, that the walk back to the cabin would cost him more than the walk down had, that his reserves were low, and his body not as willing to be coaxed into repeated exertions as it once had been. And part of him understood that it was entirely possible he would not make it all the way, that he might sink down somewhere between here and there, and not get back up. The knowledge did not come as a jolt now, but as a plain, unadorned fact, and in the thin, bright space that opened in him around it, he found, to his own mild surprise, a kind of peace, as if the fear that had gnawed at him in so many shapes of dying wrong, of dying alone, of dying without having said what needed saying, had finally chewed itself out. He turned, slowly, feeling for the familiar angles of the rock and the first small step up, and as he did he had the unmistakable impression of something large and warm moving with him, not pressed to his sight in the guiding way of that first journey, but pacing just out of contact, matching his careful turns. He did not reach out this time, did not test the air with his hand to confirm what his skin and ears already told him. He accepted the presence as he accepted the sound of the spring behind him and the ache in his knees, one more element in a world that had never bothered to explain itself fully. The climb back toward the cabin awaited him with its treacherous crust and its tired muscles and its uncertain distances, but as he stood on the narrow ledge above the water, the cold seeping through the soles of his boots into his feet, he allowed himself one more small private indulgence. He tilted his head slightly toward the space beside him, where the warmth seemed thickest, and spoke, barely above a whisper, a simple phrase that contained in its few words all the apology and all the gratitude and all the complicated love he had been dragging with him for years. "I'm ready," he said, and the words, once spoken, did not echo or bounce, but settled into the damp air and stayed there, quiet and complete, as the breath of the mountain moved around him and the spring flowed on. By the time the first real warmth threaded itself up the mountain, a thin, tentative breeze that smelled of damp earth, and something green still folded tight in the soil, Ezra's cabin stood quiet at the edge of the trees, its windows dull with a film of late winter grime, its porch bare of the usual small signs of occupation, no fresh wood chips from a recently split log, no wet boot prints drying in a stuttering path from door to steps, no thin line of smoke from the stovepipe to mark the slow, everyday work of keeping one old man and four old walls at a livable temperature. The snow in the yard had pulled back in uneven patches, leaving islands of dirty white marooned among broad swathes of dark saturated ground, and thin threads of water ran through the low places, carrying grit and old leaves, and the occasional cigarette butt from some long ago visitor down toward the impatient creek. In the woods below the cabin, where the slope dipped toward a narrow ravine that held, at its base, the spring, the season's change was written in sound as much as in sight. The spring, which had hummed all winter under its crust of ice, now spoke louder, its rush swollen by the meltwater streaming down from higher drifts, the pitch of it higher and clearer, like a voice freed from a hand over its mouth. Smaller rivulets, which had been silent under snow, now trickled and gurgled along newly opened channels, their paths bright against the dark soil, and the farther one walked from the road, the more the layered chorus of water filled the spaces between tree trunks, drowning out the distant, mechanical noises from town with something older and less directional. It was along one of those damp awakening paths that two men from Cedar Falls moved in careful single file one mild afternoon, their boots sinking slightly into the softened ground, leaving behind deep, clearly edged prints that filled slowly with seeping water. They had been at the task since morning, following a rough map drawn on the back of an envelope at the diner, a half-remembered set of directions from Ruth Hadley and a younger cousin who had promised, over coffee and eggs, that the old spring where Ezra and Margaret used to go lay just a bit beyond where the ridge dips. You can't miss the sound once you're close. And for most of the climb, they had alternated between grumbling about the mud and falling quiet under the steady pull of the incline. The first man, Tom, stopped when he heard it, his hand going up in that unconscious sign to halt that people who spend time in the woods develop long before they learn any official version. The second Dean slid to a stop behind him, one gloved hand catching the rough bark of a nearby sapling to steady himself, and they both tilted their heads in the same direction, toward the deeper notch in the hillside where the sound of water, up until then a general background murmur, sharpened into a specific, more insistent rush. "That's got to be it," Dean said under his breath, though there was no one around to hear them, but the birds and whatever small animals had begun to stir in the leaf litter, his voice thinner in the cool air than it would have been indoors, and Tom nodded, the brim of his cap dipping as he adjusted his grip on the strap of the pack slung over his shoulder. They pushed on the last few yards steeper, the ground slick with a mixture of meltwater and old, decomposing leaves that gave way in damp clumps under their boots. The smell of the place changed as they descended. The general mustiness of late winter woods gave way to the sharper, cleaner scent of cold water and exposed stone, layered with the faint sourness of mud newly awakened from its frozen state, and tucked in the corners of that mix was the first, almost imperceptible hint of green knot leaves yet, but the living, restless smell of things about to push through. The spring revealed itself the way such places often do, all at once and yet, as if it had always been there waiting for their eyes, a narrow rocky bowl cut into the slope, water spilling continuously from a cleft in the stone with a clear, tireless force that sent up a fine spray, darkening the rock around it to a deep, glossy gray. The pool at its base was not large, but it was deep enough that the water in its center glowed a darker color than the edges, and the surface was in constant motion, small ripples radiating outward to where the overflow slipped over a rounded lip, and ran away down a shallow channel, already eating its way through the remnants of snow like a slow, determined knife. Tom stood at the edge of the shallow bowl and took off his cap, not out of any articulated reverence, but because the place invited it, the cool breath of the spring lifting the sweat-damp hair on his forehead, and for a moment he simply listened, letting the sound fill his chest. Dean, less given to pauses, stepped carefully around the rim, testing the footing with each placement of his boot, and it was he who saw the tracks first, his eyes drawn downward by the subtle irregularities in the damp, dark soil near the water's edge. Hey, he called softly, not wanting to raise his voice in a place that felt discontained, and Tom turned toward the note in his tone, eyebrows lifting. The tracks lay side by side in the soft, saturated ground, the impressions clear and fresh enough that water had only just begun to pool in the lowest parts of them, and their juxtaposition was so striking that for a second Dean's mind, used to seeing such things in separate contexts, refused to quite line them up. On the left, closest to the rock, were the prints of a man's boot, the tread worn but discernible, the heel digging a little deeper at the back where the weight had settled. On the right, overlapping in places and then pulling ahead, were the marks of a large canine, the toes tight and forward, the pads deep, the stride between them longer than most farm dogs could manage, each track tidy and purposeful, leading toward the same spot by the water where the stone dipped lower, and an old smooth notch indicated the place where a person might kneel. Tom crouched with a quiet groan of protest from his knees, the damp seeping instantly through the seat of his pants, and traced one of the boot prints with a calloused finger, the cold mud clinging to his skin. That looks about right for his size, he said after a moment, picturing Ezra in his mind as he had last seen him years ago. Thinner now in his imagination, a little stooped, but still with that particular way of planting his feet that came from a lifetime on uneven ground. And that, Dean added, gesturing with his chin toward the paw prints, is one big damn dog or not a dog. He reached out as well, his hand hovering just above the nearest track, feeling the coolness of the damp earth radiate up into his palm, and he thought, with a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature, of all the stories they had heard over the winter, the calf torn up in McKendry's pasture, the shadow on Mrs. Raleigh's porch, the hunters' talk in the diner of a lone wolf moving through the woods with no pack in sight. The pattern of the prints told a small story of its own. They came down the slope from the direction of the cabin, the boot marks sometimes a little off to one side, as if their maker had tested his balance, the paw prints often closer in, occasionally almost touching, as if the animal had brushed against the man's leg. Near the water's edge, the boots stopped in a pair of deeper impressions, the toes angled slightly outward as if the person had braced himself, and the paw marks circled once, twice, then settled into a pair of neat side-by-side prints just off to the right, facing the same direction, the claws scoring faint lines in the mud where they had dug in. There were no other human tracks, no sign of anyone having come after, no scuffs or smears that would suggest a hurried departure or a struggle, only the twin lines of boot and paw leading in, and then, farther along the rim of the bowl, a point where they turned together toward the narrow path that curved away along the contour of the hill. The prints there were a little more spaced, the boot impressions less deep, as if the person's weight had shifted forward rather than down, and Dean, who had done a little tracking in his younger days, squinted at them, his forehead creasing under the brim of his cap. "Looks like they left together," he said quietly, the words sounding oddly loud against the steady rush of the water, and Tom grunted, not quite agreement and not quite dissent. They followed the trail a short way along the ridge, boots sinking into the softer spots where the thaw had gone deeper, and after a few dozen yards, the tracks broke into a patch of remaining snow, the crust there thin and rotted, collapsing under the weight that had passed over it. In the snow, the prints looked different, the edges softer, the shapes more transient, yet the pairing remained, one elongated oval punched in by a heel, one four-toed pad print sinking almost as deeply, and the sight of them side by side in that fleeting medium, already beginning to blur at the edges under the weak sun, did something to Tom's chest. That he would have been hard-pressed to name. They did not find Ezra that day, not his body or any clear sign of where he had laid himself down. And there would be other searchers later, more systematic, with radios crackling and bright tape to mark the grids they walked, who would comb the slopes and hollows and find, eventually, only a few small things, the cracked handle of a cane wedged under a fallen branch, the battered plastic jug half buried in runoff silt, not nearly enough to satisfy those who needed a neat official ending. For Tom and Dean, standing there by the spring with the water's breath cool on their faces and the paired tracks softening slowly into the ground, the absence was not a hole to be filled, but a kind of quiet. And after a while, when the chill of standing still too long began to creep up their legs, they turned back toward the cabin, not speaking much, each carrying his own version of the story in his head. Spring came on in earnest in the weeks that followed, the change quickening with that suddenness it sometimes has in the mountains, as if the season had been waiting just beyond a curtain, and, once allowed through, rushed the stage all at once. The snow retreated to the highest shadows and then vanished completely, leaving behind a landscape raw and shiny with melt, the ground a patchwork of dark saturated soil and new green shoots. Small, bright flowers pushed up in the lee of rocks and at the bases of trees, their colors startling against the leftover browns and grays, and the trees themselves began to show the first soft haze of buds, a green that was more promise than fulfillment, but still enough to change the line of the ridge against the sky. Around the cabin, life reasserted itself in small practical ways. Ruth came up with the younger cousin and a box of trash bags, their boots squelching in the soft ground, and they aired out the rooms, opening the windows to let in the mild, damp air and the sounds of running water and distant birdsong. The pump was tested and found still working. Grudgingly, the pantry shelves were sorted, jars of canned beans and tomatoes held up to the light, though the light meant nothing to any. One there who remembered how Ezra had once turned each jar in his hands, feeling for the slight give that meant a seal had broken. The bed was stripped and remade, the thin mattress turned, more from habit than necessity, and Margaret's coat was taken down from its peg at last, the wool shedding a small puff of dust as Ruth's hands, smaller and older than they had been when Margaret wore it, folded it against her chest. News of Ezra's absence, of the tracks found at the spring and the lack of anything else, traveled through Cedar Falls and the surrounding hollers, the way such news always does, carried in the low conversations at the diner, in the murmured exchanges after church, in the stops at mailbox clusters along the road. Some said he had wandered off disoriented and succumbed to the cold somewhere under a tangle of rhododendron, his body taken by scavengers and covered by leaves before the thaw. Others that had misjudged the depth of the spring and fallen in, the water closing over him and carrying him in some slow, dismantling way, into the larger system of creeks and streams that laced the valley. A few, lowering their voices and glancing, despite themselves, toward the tree line, suggested that the wolf people had been talking about all winter had finally taken him, whether in attack or in some strange protective gesture. None of them could quite articulate without feeling foolish. Ruth, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling between her palms, listened to all of it, the various speculations and reassurances, and said little. In her mind, the image that held was not of Ezra struggling or lost, but of the description Tom had given her of the tracks by the spring, the boot prints and the paw marks side by side, the way they had turned together as they left. She had known Ezra and Margaret both a long time. She had watched them argue and reconcile, strain and settle, and she had seen, in Ezra's face at the funeral, and in the stiff, brittle way he carried himself in the years afterward, a grief so dense it had its own weather. If there was any mercy in the idea that he had not gone into that last stretch entirely alone, she was willing to take it, whether the companion had been animal, spirit, or some strange liminal thing that did not care what name people gave it. Up on the ridge, the cabin grew quieter as the season turned. The windows Ruth had open were closed again, their panes reflecting the new bright green of the leaves, instead of the flat gray of winter sky, and the path to the woodpile began to blur under new growth, last fall's chopped and buried under ferns and opportunistic grasses. Birds nested in the eaves, their morning chatter stitching the early light to the roofline, and small animals moved more boldly in the yard, their tracks crisscrossing in the damp soil, where once only one old man's boots had left a regular pattern. In the evenings, when the light thinned but the air still held the day's mildness, the woods around the cabin filled with the layered sounds of mountain spring frogs starting up in the low marshy spots by the creek, their voices bubbling and overlapping, the soft persistent rush of water in the ravine, the occasional sharp bark of a fox from farther up the slope. The sky overhead, unseen by the man who was no longer there, faded from blue to a pale tender gray, then deepened, one by one drawing out the first stars, their cold distant glitter pricking through the branches, until the forest stood outlined against a dark that was softer and more forgiving than the hard winter version. It was on one such evening, when the day had been warm enough that the first real insects of the year had ventured out around the river's edge, and the air now turned cooler by slow gentle degrees, rather than in a single sudden drop, that a shape materialized at the edge of the yard, as if it had always belonged there. The wolf, its coat no longer fluffed against the bite of deep cold, but lying sleek along the lines of its body, gray fur shot through with lighter and darker strands that caught what little light remained, moved out of the trees, with the same unhurried deliberation it had shown on the nights it came to the porch, each paw placed with care on the soft ground, leaving behind clear prints that would show plainly in the morning if anyone came to look. It did not go to the door. The cabin sat with its face turned toward the road, its empty windows blank and still, and the wolf's amber eyes, reflecting the thin light that seeped back from the clearing, passed over it once, calmly, then moved on. Instead, it crossed to the spot where the yard began to give way to the first slope of the hill, the place where Ezra had stood so many times with his hand on the porch railing, listening to the woods, and there it paused, haunches lowering as it settled into a sitting position, its gaze directed not at the cabin, but into the tangle of trees and undergrowth beyond. From where it sat, the sounds of the waking season flowed around it, the faint splash of something in the creek, the rustle of a small animal in the dry leaves, the thin far-off hum of a truck on the main road carrying someone somewhere into their own business, and the scents crowded its nose, rich and layered, the damp sweetness of new growth. Mixing with the sharp feral traces of other animals, the old ghostly smell of wood smoke from a stovepipe gone cold. If there lingered, in the boards of the porch and the packed earth of the yard, any trace of the man who had lived there, some faint human salt and sweat and breath woven into the grain, the wolf took that in too, its nostrils flaring briefly. It sat until the last of the light slipped away and the clearing folded itself into the general darkness of the hillside, its outline slowly becoming just another shadow among many. And for that stretch of time, the air around the cabin held a peculiar, exact balance, no menace, no urgency, just the sober, attentive presence of a creature fully at home in itself, inhabiting, for a little while, the space where a man had once stood unsure. When the night had deepened enough that the stars overhead burned more fiercely and the sounds of the woods had settled into their nocturnal pattern, the wolf rose in a single fluid motion, shook once, its coat rippling like water, and turned away, slipping back into the trees without hurry, its paws silent on the soft-thawed ground, leaving behind only the pattern of its tracks in the damp earth and the faint echo of its warmth in the cooling air.